She arrived in Iron Creek with $43, a suitcase held shut with twine, and a dead man's name on her lips. The man she'd crossed 3 states to marry was already in the ground, and the town that was supposed to welcome her wanted her gone before sundown. But then she walked into that council meeting. 3 little girls sat in the front row, backs straight, eyes dry, pretending they weren't terrified. And Eliza Rowan, broke, homeless, and alone, did the one thing nobody in that room had the nerve to do. She raised her hand. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments, and let me see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The stagecoach rolled into Iron Creek on a Thursday morning in late October, and Eliza Rowan was the only passenger who stepped down without someone waiting for her on the other side. She stood on the edge of the wooden platform and let the dust settle around her boots while the driver heaved her suitcase down from the roof. The twine she'd knotted around the latch 3 weeks ago in Missouri was still holding, just barely. The suitcase hit the ground and a corner buckled inward. She picked it up without looking at it. Iron Creek was not what she'd imagined. She wasn't sure what she'd imagined exactly. Something more hopeful, maybe. The main street ran maybe 400 yards before it gave up at the base of a clay-colored ridge. The buildings were mostly raw lumber and weather stain. A few had painted signs. Most didn't bother. The sky above them was the flat, ungenerous gray of early winter, trying to make up its mind. A woman with a market basket on her arm slowed when she passed Eliza and looked her over. The way people look at something unfamiliar, not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing. Then she kept walking. Eliza shifted the suitcase to her other hand and pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The handwriting across the top belonged to a man named Douglas Pell. "Come by October 15th if you intend to honor the arrangement," he'd written in the flat, careful script of someone who didn't write many personal letters. "The house is modest, but sound. I'm a straightforward man and expect the same." She had written back that she intended to honor the arrangement. She had sold her mother's sewing table to buy the ticket. Douglas Pell had died of a chest fever on October 9th. She'd learned this from a telegram she received at a way station in Kansas 4 days into the journey. She'd read it twice, sitting on a wooden bench while a stranger's child threw peanut shells at the floorboards nearby. Then she'd folded it into her pocket and gotten back on the next stage west because she had nowhere else to go. There was a man leaning against the post office doorframe with a toothpick in his teeth, watching her with the idle curiosity of someone who had nothing better to do. She walked toward him. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for the council hall." He moved the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. "You the woman was supposed to marry Doug Pell?" News moved fast in small towns. She'd forgotten that. "Yes. He's dead." "I know he's dead." The man looked at her suitcase, then back at her face, then pushed himself off the doorframe with his shoulder. "Council hall's up at the end, the painted blue door," he pointed. "They got a meeting tonight, if that's any use to you." It wasn't particularly, but she thanked him and walked toward the blue door anyway, because it was the only direction she had. In sec, she found a room for the night at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Caldwell, a compact, gray-haired woman who took $2 up front without being asked, and showed Eliza to a room at the end of the second-floor hallway with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out at the back of a livery stable. "You'll have to find something more permanent soon," Mrs. Caldwell said, not unkindly. "I only let rooms by the week during winter, and I'm already half full. How long do I have?" "Week, maybe 10 days?" She paused at the door. "I'm sorry about Douglas. He wasn't a warm man, but he was reliable. That counts for something out here." Eliza set her suitcase on the bed. "It does," she said. After Mrs. Caldwell left, she sat on the edge of the mattress and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since Kansas. $43. The room was $2 a night. Train fare back east was money she didn't have, even if she wanted to go, which she wasn't sure she did, because there was nothing back east except a rented room that had already been let to someone else and a string of small failures she wasn't eager to return to. She was 31 years old. She had a teaching certificate from the state of Missouri that was 2 years out of date. She had a suitcase of winter clothes and a few books and her mother's silver hairbrush that she'd refused to sell. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to think practically, the way she'd always told herself she was capable of thinking when things got bad. The ceiling had a water stain shaped vaguely like a hand. She thought, find work. Find something. She fell asleep before she could think what. The council meeting that Thursday evening was held in a low-ceilinged room behind the assayer's office. About 20 people packed the benches, ranchers, shopkeepers, a few women who sat together near the back wall. Eliza took a seat on the end of a bench near the door because she wasn't sure she was supposed to be there and wanted the option to leave without making a production of it. She hadn't come for any particular reason. She'd come because Mrs. Caldwell had mentioned it at supper and because the alternative was sitting alone in her room with the arithmetic. The 5 men at the table in the front were the town council. She gathered their names gradually from the way people addressed them. Harmon Keach, who appeared to be the head of the council and had the bearing of someone who'd been told he was important often enough to believe it. Rudolph Finch, the land commissioner, who was younger and wrote things down constantly. 3 others whose names she caught only partially. The first 20 minutes were about fence disputes and a new assessment on water usage. She paid half attention. Then a man named Gerald Moody stood up from the back of the room and spoke, and the whole quality of the room changed. "We need to settle the matter of the Calloway girls," Moody said. He was a heavy-set man with close-cropped gray hair and the particular authority of someone who served on committees. "The house burned in August. The parents have been gone 3 months. The estate is in debt. There's no family to take them in, and the town can't leave 3 children in limbo indefinitely." Eliza shifted on the bench and looked toward the front row. She had noticed the girls when she sat down, and then let her eyes move away without thinking much about it. 3 children sitting very straight and very still in a row, the way children do when they're trying not to draw attention to themselves. Now she looked at them properly. The oldest was maybe 12 or 13, dark hair pulled back with a strip of cloth. She was sitting with her arms crossed over her stomach, not in an angry way, just the way you fold your arms when you're cold and trying not to show it. Her face was blank in a manner that was too controlled to be natural, the blankness of someone who has been told to hold themselves together and is doing it by sheer will. The middle girl was younger, 8 or 9, with her hair in 2 braids that someone had done carefully this morning, the way you do a child's hair when you want them to look presentable for something important. She was holding the hand of the youngest, who was small, maybe 5 or 6, and who had fallen asleep against her older sister's arm with her thumb in her mouth. Eliza watched them and felt something settle in her chest. Not sentimentality, exactly. Something more specific than that. "The proposal on the table," Keach said from the front, shuffling papers, "is to place each girl with a family in the valley who has agreed to provide room and board in exchange for work assistance in the household." "Separate families?" someone in the back row asked. "That's the arrangement." The oldest girl's arms tightened across her stomach. She didn't look up. "Hazel Calloway is old enough to be useful in a kitchen or with livestock," Moody said, and the word useful landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. "Clara's placement is with the Heinrichs, who have 4 children of their own and could use help, and the youngest—" "Her name is May," the oldest girl said. The room went quiet. Hazel Calloway was looking straight at Gerald Moody with an expression that was perfectly composed except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. "Her name is May, not the youngest." Moody looked at her the way adults look at children who've said something inconvenient. "Hazel, and my sister Clara is afraid of strangers. She doesn't do well when—" Hazel stopped. She pressed her lips together. Something moved across her face that she pulled back quickly, and she looked down at her hands. Clara, sitting next to her, had gone very still. The little one, May, slept on. Eliza heard herself speak before she decided to. "Wait," she said. Several heads turned. She was still sitting on the end of the bench near the door, and she became suddenly conscious that she was wearing her traveling clothes, which were dusty, and that nobody in this room knew who she was. Keach frowned at her. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a council proceeding. I understand." She stood up. Her heart was going faster than she'd have liked. "My name is Eliza Rowan. I arrived today. I was intended for Douglas Pell." The room shifted. She saw the recognition move through it. I'm sorry for your loss, Keach said, in a tone that suggested he was also sorry for the complication. I'd like to offer an alternative proposal, Eliza said, regarding the girls. But she hadn't planned any of this. That was the thing she kept coming back to later, in the days and weeks that followed. She had not walked into that meeting with a plan. She'd walked in because she had nowhere else to be. But she stood up in that low-ceilinged room with 20 strangers looking at her, and she heard herself make the case as clearly as she could, which was not very clearly, because she was making it up as she went, and her mouth was slightly ahead of her thinking. She said she was a capable woman. She said she had a teaching certificate and experience managing a household. She said the girls deserved to stay together, and that separating them, parceling them out to 3 different families as household labor, was not a solution. It was just a way of not solving the problem. Moody said, "With respect, Miss Rowan, you arrived this morning without a home or a husband or visible means of support." "I know what I arrived without," she said. "And you're proposing to take on 3 children?" "I'm proposing to keep 3 children together." "On what income? Where? You'd be living on what exactly?" She had not thought about this part. She stood in front of 20 people and did not have an answer to that question, and the silence stretched out long enough that she started to feel the heat coming up the back of her neck. "The Calloway homestead," said a quiet voice. She turned. It was the older woman from the back row, maybe 60, with steel-gray hair and a face that had been weathered into something durable. She was looking at Eliza steadily. "The property's in debt," the woman continued, talking to the room more than to anyone specific. "But it hasn't been foreclosed. The girls are the legal heirs. If someone takes legal guardianship, they take the ranch with it. Land, debt, and all." She paused. "The house burned down, but the land is still there." Keach said, "Mrs. Pratt, nobody wants to take on a burned-out homestead with back taxes." "Then there's your answer about why these children have been sitting in limbo for 3 months," Mrs. Pratt said, and the room went quiet again. Eliza looked at the girls. Hazel was looking back at her now with an expression that was impossible to read. Not hopeful, not distrustful, just watchful. The way you look at something that might matter and you haven't decided yet. "I'll take the guardianship," Eliza said, "and the land." The sound in the room was not quite murmuring and not quite silence, something between. Finch, the land commissioner, looked up from his papers. "Miss Rowan, the homestead has outstanding taxes dating back 18 months. You'd be taking on that debt." "I understand." "The house is a ruin. You'd have no shelter." "There are outbuildings," Mrs. Pratt said from the back. "The barn's still standing, I believe." "You'd be taking on 3 children with no income source in winter." "I know," Eliza said. Keach looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't tell if he was trying to talk her out of it or simply assessing whether she was serious. "This isn't a decision to make lightly. You've been in this town for what, 6 hours?" "7, she said. "I've been thinking about it the whole time." She hadn't been thinking about it at all, but it sounded better than the truth. The paperwork took 2 days. Finch was meticulous, and there were forms she had to sign in triplicate, and Keach kept finding things that needed to be verified or clarified, in the way that bureaucrats find complications when they're not entirely comfortable with a decision but can't find grounds to block it outright. On the second day, Eliza sat across from Finch's desk while he read through the deed transfer for the 4th time, and she looked at the map tacked to his wall. The valley laid out in clean lines, properties marked in different inks. The Calloway land sat near the northern edge, a rectangle of maybe 80 acres that backed up against a ridgeline. She'd never seen it. She didn't entirely know what 80 acres of frontier land looked like from the inside. "Miss Rowan," Finch said without looking up, "I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "All right. Do you actually know what you're doing?" She looked at him. He was younger than she'd thought up close, maybe 28, with ink-stained fingers and the slight squint of someone who spent too many hours reading in bad light. He wasn't asking it to be unkind. "No," she said. He looked up then. "But I know what those girls' faces looked like when the council was deciding which family to send them to," she said. "And I know I don't want them to look that way again if I can help it." Finch held her gaze for a moment, then looked back down at his papers. He stamped the deed without further comment. She met the girls properly on the afternoon of the second day. In the parlor of the house where they'd been staying, a neighbor woman named Mrs. Osgood, who'd taken them in temporarily and who had the strained, patient air of someone doing a kindness that had lasted slightly longer than expected. Eliza sat across from the three of them on a horsehair settee that was too small for all of them. Hazel sat on the left with her back straight. Clara sat in the middle, pressed close to Hazel's side, looking at the floor. May sat on the right end with her feet dangling because she was too small to reach the floor, and she was looking at Eliza with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. "I know this is strange," Eliza said. "You don't know me." "You're the woman from the meeting," May said. "Yes." "You talked a lot." May considered this. "Hazel says you don't actually have a plan." Eliza glanced at Hazel, who had the expression of someone caught saying a thing out loud that they'd meant to keep internal. "Hazel's right," Eliza said. "I don't have much of a plan. I have some money that won't last long, and a deed to your parents' land, and a general intention to figure things out as I go." May nodded, apparently satisfied by this. Clara had not looked up from the floor. She was a slight girl with Hazel's dark coloring and a quality of stillness around her that didn't feel like shyness exactly, more like she was always listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "Clara," Eliza said, gently. The girl glanced up briefly, then back down. "You don't have to say anything right now. I just want you to know you don't have to go to the Heinrichs." Clara's fingers tightened around Hazel's hand. "She doesn't like new places," Hazel said. The words came out flat and factual, not apologetic. "She'll need time." "That's all right." "She also doesn't sleep well. She has bad nights sometimes." Hazel paused. "I'm telling you now so you're not surprised." "I appreciate that." "I'm not telling you to be polite. I'm telling you because—" Hazel stopped, and for just a moment something cracked in the flat precision of her voice. She covered it quickly. "I'm telling you because the last two families we stayed with sent us back when they found out about it. I'd rather know now if that's going to be a problem." Eliza looked at her steadily. 12 years old and maybe 13, and she had already learned to front-load the bad news. "It's not going to be a problem," Eliza said. Hazel looked at her for a long moment with those watchful eyes. "How do you know? You don't know what it's like." "You're right, I don't." Eliza laced her fingers together and looked at all three of them. "But I signed a legal document 2 days ago, so unless you decide you don't want me, I'm what you've got." Hazel looked down at her lap. Then she said very quietly, "When do we go to the ranch?" "Saturday morning." A pause. "The house burned down," Hazel said. "We'd be in the barn." "I know. It's cold." "I know." Eliza paused. "Do you know how to build a fire?" Hazel blinked. "Yes." Then between the two of us, we can probably manage." May, who had been watching this entire exchange with great interest, said, "I know how to build a fire too." "Then we're ahead," Eliza said. For the first time since Eliza had walked into that parlor, something moved across May's face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It came and went quickly, as if she wasn't quite sure yet if she was allowed to have one. Saturday came with hard frost and a low, colorless sky. Mrs. Osgood helped them load a borrowed wagon with the few things the girls had managed to save from the fire. A quilt, some clothing, a tin box that Hazel held on her lap the entire ride without explaining what was in it. Mrs. Pratt had left a basket on the wagon that turned out to contain bread, salt pork, dried beans, and 2 jars of pickled beets. There was a folded note tucked in the side that said, in handwriting that had the economical precision of a woman who didn't waste words, "You'll need these more than thanks. Come find me if you're in trouble. V. Pratt." The road north out of Iron Creek was rutted and ran alongside a dry creek bed for about 3 miles before it curved toward the ridge. Eliza handled the horse because nobody else was tall enough to manage comfortably, though she'd only driven a wagon a handful of times, and it showed. The horse, a placid bay gelding borrowed from the livery, was patient with her imprecision in a way that she appreciated. The girls sat in the wagon bed. May asked questions about nearly everything they passed. Clara looked at the landscape with that quiet attention that seemed characteristic of her. Hazel looked at the road ahead with the same controlled expression she'd worn in the council meeting. "How long have you been in the barn?" Eliza asked after a while. "We haven't," Hazel said. We've been at Mrs. Osgood since August. Have you been back to the property? A pause. Once, right after. What's it like? Hazel looked at the road for a moment. The barn's solid. Pa built it before the house, so it's the better of the two. She paused again. The house is a ruin, one wall standing. You can see the floor where the kitchen was. Eliza drove the wagon and did not say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say about that. There's a root cellar, Hazel continued, in the same practical tone. Access doors in the yard, not in the house, so it survived. There's a smokehouse that only lost its roof, and there's a well that Pa started digging last spring. She stopped. Didn't finish it? No. Something shifted in Hazel's voice just slightly. He stopped in July. He got busy with something else. Then things happened. She said things happened the way someone says it when they're not ready to say what the things were. Eliza let it rest. The first sight of the Calloway homestead was, if she was honest with herself, worse than she'd expected. The house was a black skeleton, 3 walls of charred timber and a collapsed roof, the interior open to the sky. The ground around it was still darkened in a rough circle where the fire had spread before someone managed to contain it. One stone chimney stood fully intact in the center of the ruin, which was almost worse than if it had fallen too, because it looked like a gravestone. The barn was, as Hazel had said, solid, old gray wood, sound roof, a wide door that opened stiffly but opened. Inside there were stalls that hadn't held animals in months, a loft full of hay that smelled faintly of dust and old summers, and a wood stove in the corner that Eliza crouched in front of for a long minute, inspecting the flue. It works, Hazel said from the doorway. Pa used it when he was doing late work in here. Eliza stood up. The barn was cold, but not brutal, insulated by the hay and the old wood in a way the open air outside wasn't. They could make it work. It wasn't a house, but they could make it work. She stood in the middle of the barn floor, May hovering close to her elbow, Clara standing just inside the doorway, and thought about the arithmetic again. Different arithmetic this time. Wood, food, water. There was a hand pump near the yard that Hazel said still worked. Weeks until winter hit properly. $41 and change. She thought about the unfinished well, about the tin box Hazel still hadn't put down. All right, she said. Let's get the stove going. That first night in the barn was the kind of cold that settles into your bones by midnight and is still there in the morning. Eliza woke twice, once to add wood to the stove, once because Clara made a sound in her sleep that brought her upright before she was fully awake, hand reaching for nothing. The sound stopped before she could do anything about it. Clara was asleep, curled tight against Hazel's back, both of them bundled in the quilt from Mrs. Osgood's basket. May was across the barn in her own section of hay, asleep on her stomach with both arms tucked beneath her. She slept with the profound unconsciousness of young children and small animals. Eliza lay back on her own pallet of hay and listened to the wind work at the barn door and looked at the dark overhead and thought about the well. In the morning, she'd look at the well. In the morning, she'd figure out what came next. For now, she pulled her coat tighter and closed her eyes and listened to the 3 small sounds of breathing around her, and the wind outside, and the land that was, somehow, improbably, through a decision she still wasn't sure she understood, hers, theirs, hers and theirs. She held on to that small distinction as she drifted back toward sleep, not knowing yet that the land beneath her, this burned and indebted and seemingly worthless stretch of frontier ground, was worth more than anything else in the valley. Not knowing yet what that was going to cost them. The well was 12 feet deep and going nowhere useful. Eliza stood at the edge of it on that first full morning, looking down into the dark, and tried to remember everything she didn't know about wells, which was most things. The shaft was hand-dug, lined with flat stones for maybe the first 6 feet, then raw earth below that, and at the bottom there was nothing. No water, no seep, just dry, dark dirt that told her exactly nothing about why Thomas Calloway had stopped digging in July. Hazel came to stand beside her. She'd been up before Eliza, which Eliza had discovered when she woke to find the stove already fed and the barn door cracked open to the gray morning light. Pa dug it himself, Hazel said. She was looking at the well the way she looked at most things, straight on, without softening it. He said he could feel the water, said he knew it was there. How far down did he think it was? He never said exactly. A pause. He got quiet about it toward the end, about a lot of things. Eliza looked at her. What kind of things? Hazel's jaw tightened just slightly. I don't know all of it. He and Ma talked at night after we were in bed. I heard pieces. She paused. He found something in the east field, something in the ground. He was excited about it for a while, and then he stopped being excited and started being careful. Careful how? Like he was watching over his shoulder. Hazel turned away from the well. He wrote things down. He always wrote things down. He kept journals going back years. But those last few weeks he was writing constantly, and he hid them. Eliza said nothing, waiting. I don't know where, Hazel said before she could ask. I looked after the fire. I thought maybe the root cellar, but I didn't find anything. I thought maybe the barn. She stopped. I didn't find anything. They stood in the cold morning air and looked at the unfinished well, and Eliza thought about a man who felt the water beneath his feet and started writing things down and watching over his shoulder, and who was dead 3 months later, along with his wife, in a fire that had taken the house but left the barn standing. She thought about that last part for a moment, then she filed it away and went to start breakfast. Mugged. The days that followed had a grinding, relentless quality that left no room for self-pity, which was perhaps the one mercy of their situation. There was always something that needed doing, and usually several things that needed doing at once, and the list of what they didn't have was long enough that Eliza had stopped writing it down because writing it down made it look worse than dealing with it one piece at a time. The barn was livable, barely, and with considerable effort. Eliza used 12 of her remaining dollars on a second trip to Iron Creek, lamp oil, a sack of cornmeal, dried beef, 2 blankets, a hammer, and a box of nails. She came back to find that Hazel had, in her absence, repaired a gap in the barn wall using scraps of lumber from the ruined house and a technique that was rough but effective. Where'd you learn that? Eliza asked. Pa. Hazel didn't look up from driving a nail. Her swings were short and controlled and she didn't miss. He said a person should know how to fix what they live in. Clara, meanwhile, had taken to the root cellar. This was not something Eliza had anticipated. The root cellar was a low earthen room accessed by a slanted wooden door in the yard, and it contained the remains of the previous harvest, some soft potatoes, 2 jars of preserves that had survived, a sack of dried corn that was mostly still good. Clara had gone down the first morning and come back up with one of the potato jars and a report on the inventory that was more thorough than Eliza would have managed. She likes small spaces, Hazel explained. She's always been that way. When she was little, she used to hide in the wardrobe. That's not unusual, Eliza said carefully. I know, I'm just telling you so you don't worry when you can't find her. Clara, for her part, continued to avoid looking directly at Eliza for the better part of the first week, which Eliza accepted. She didn't push. She made sure there was food and warmth and that nobody asked Clara to do things she wasn't ready for, and she waited. May had no such reservations. May talked. She talked at breakfast and while doing chores and in the evenings when they sat around the stove, and she talked with the free, uncensored quality of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to edit herself, which meant that Eliza learned things about the Calloway family in odd, irregular pieces. Their father's habit of humming when he was thinking, their mother's bread that was better than anyone else's in the valley, the dog they'd had who ran away the previous spring, a neighbor boy who'd stolen May's hair ribbon and never gave it back. Tell me about before, Eliza said one evening, when the stove was going and the lamp was lit and the wind was making its usual complaints at the barn door. May looked up from the corn husk doll she was attempting to make with Eliza's uncertain assistance. Before what? Before August. What was it like here? May considered this with the gravity she brought to most questions. Good, she said. We had chickens. I named them, but Pa said not to because then you get sad when they stop being chickens. He was probably right. He was right about most things. May pulled at a husk. Are you going to get us chickens? Maybe, when things are more settled. How settled? More than they are now. May seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer and went back to the husk. Across the barn, Hazel was reading by the lamp. a worn book she'd had in the tin box she'd carried from Mrs. Osgood's. Clara was mending a sock with the slow, serious concentration she gave to most tasks. Eliza watched them and thought, 1 week down. She didn't let herself think much further ahead than that. It was Clara who found the journals, not in the root cellar and not in the barn. She found them on the 9th day, when a heavy frost came in overnight, and Eliza went out in the early morning to check the pump and found it frozen. She was crouched over the pump housing with a rag and a pot of hot water when she heard Clara's voice behind her, so not a word exactly, more a sharp intake of breath that made Eliza drop the pot and spin around. Clara was standing at the base of the stone chimney that still stood in the ruin of the house. She was looking at something in the gap between the chimney's base and the remaining foundation stones. Eliza crossed the yard and crouched down beside her. The gap was maybe 8 inches wide, a space between the chimney's fieldstone base and the frost-heaved foundation that might have always been there or might have opened up when the house burned and the timbers fell away. Clara had a stick she'd been using to poke at something inside. What was inside was a tin box, larger than Hazel's, wrapped in oilcloth that had blackened with heat but held together. Eliza worked it out with her fingers, her breath fogging in the cold air. Clara watched without moving. The oilcloth was sealed with wire. Eliza got the wire off and unwrapped the cloth and opened the tin and looked at what Thomas Calloway had considered worth hiding behind a chimney and wrapping in oilskin. 3 composition notebooks, a folded paper that turned out to be a map of the valley with annotations in cramped handwriting, and a sealed envelope addressed to no one with "Keep this safe" written on the front in block letters that had pressed through the paper. She looked up and found Clara watching her. "Good eyes," Eliza said. Clara looked at the ground, but something moved through her expression that was close to satisfaction. She waited until the girls were asleep that night. Then she sat by the lamp with the tin's contents spread on the barn floor and read. Thomas Calloway had been a methodical writer, boss. Not eloquent, not dramatic, just a man writing down what he observed in the same careful way he probably built walls or laid fence posts. The first notebook covered the previous 2 years, mostly agricultural notes, weather records, prices at the market. She skimmed through. The second notebook started in April, and about halfway through it, the handwriting changed. Not dramatically, he didn't suddenly write faster or messier, but the observations started to cluster around a specific subject, and the entries got longer. April 14th. Digging the new well in the east corner. Hit a layer of blue clay at 9 feet that doesn't match anything I've seen before. The moisture content in this clay is unusual, wetter than it should be at this depth given the dry conditions above. April 22nd. Water seeping through the clay layer overnight. Not a trickle. Significant seep. I've started collecting it. This is not a surface water issue. This is coming from below. May 3rd. I've been thinking about this and I think I need to look into it further before I tell anyone. The water table in this valley is supposed to be exhausted. That's been Granger's position for 2 years, which is why he pushed through the water usage assessment. But if there's a subsurface reservoir under this property, that changes things considerably. Eliza stopped. She turned back and read that paragraph again. Then she kept going. May 11th. I've done more measuring. The seep is consistent and has actually increased over the past week. I think the reservoir is substantial. I don't know how large. I need someone with the right knowledge to assess it properly. I've been trying to think of who I can trust with this, and I keep coming back to the same problem. Anyone who knows what this means will also know what it means for Granger. May 20th. I found something in the land records that I wasn't supposed to find. I don't think it was supposed to be findable. It was buried in the reassessment filings from 18 months ago, but the original recording is still in the Territorial Archive. Granger's land commissioner has been filing amended deeds. The amendments changed the water rights language in a way that would transfer subsurface water rights to the Granger Consolidated Holdings without the original landowners knowing. It's been happening for 3 years. I don't think most of the families in this valley realize what they signed. Eliza sat back on her heels. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light across the barn floor. Outside, the wind had settled into a low, constant pressure against the walls. She looked at the sealed envelope with "Keep this safe" on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper that turned out to be a notarized copy of 2 land records, the original filing and the amended version side by side, with the differences circled in ink. The notarization was dated June 3rd, and the notary was a man in the territorial capital whose name she didn't recognize. Thomas Calloway had ridden to the territorial capital to get those documents notarized, and 6 weeks later he and his wife were dead in a house fire, and his 3 daughters were sitting in a council meeting waiting to be parceled out like household goods. She folded the papers very carefully and put them back in the tin. She told Hazel in the morning, "Not everything, not all at once." She thought about how to tell it and decided the straightforward way was probably the only one that would work with Hazel, who had a finely calibrated sense for when adults were managing her. She laid the notebooks and the map and the envelope on the barn floor between them and said, "Your father found something. I think that's what you were trying to tell me about him being careful." Hazel looked at the materials for a long moment. Then she sat down cross-legged on the barn floor and pulled the second notebook toward her without asking permission. She read for a while without speaking. May had gone to the root cellar with Clara, which Eliza was quietly grateful for. "Granger," Hazel said finally. "She said the name the way you say the name of a thing you already knew was wrong but didn't have words for. You know him. Everyone knows him. He owns the mill, the water assessment contracts, half the grazing leases in the Southern Valley." Hazel set the notebook down and looked at Eliza with an expression that was older than it should have been on a 13-year-old face. "He came out here once, last summer, before the fire. He and Pa talked out in the yard. I watched from the barn." "What happened?" "I couldn't hear everything. Pa's voice stayed quiet. Granger's didn't." She paused. Granger pointed at the east field at one point, and Pa said something. I caught the last part. He said, "This land belongs to my family, and what's under it does too." Eliza let that sit for a moment. "Granger left," Hazel continued. "Pa came back inside, and he didn't say anything about it. But that night he moved the tin box." "You saw him." "I wasn't asleep." Hazel looked at her hands. "I didn't say anything because he'd want me to pretend I hadn't seen. He was like that. He didn't want us to worry." Her voice went flat on the last sentence in a way that made it clear she understood now what the not worrying had cost. Eliza said, "I need you to understand what this is. If your father's right, if this reservoir is what he thought it was, then this land is worth considerably more than it looks, and Granger has been trying to position himself to own whatever's under it by changing the deed language. Yes." "Is that illegal?" "Falsifying land records is fraud, yes." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "So what do we do?" Eliza pulled the map toward her and unfolded it. Thomas Calloway had marked the east field, the well location, several geological notes along the ridge. "First thing is the well. I want to finish what your father started. If the reservoir is real, we need to be able to demonstrate it, not just have notebooks saying it exists." "That'll take weeks." "Probably." "We don't have weeks before the tax assessment is due." Hazel said it quietly, not accusingly, just stating the arithmetic. "I know." Eliza smoothed the map with her palm. "How much do you know about digging wells?" Hazel gave her a look. "I'm 13. Your father taught you to build walls. I'm asking about wells." A pause. "Some. He let me help for the first couple of days before Ma said it was too dangerous." She looked at the map. "I know where he stopped. I know what he was seeing in the soil." "Then you can show me." Hazel looked at her for a moment. That same watchful, measuring look she'd had in the parlor at Mrs. Osgood's. "You really think we can do this?" It wasn't quite a question. "I think your father got close enough to the right answer that people wanted him dead for it," Eliza said. "That seems like a good reason to finish what he started." They began digging on a Tuesday, Eliza and Hazel alternating while Clara and May managed the household tasks, the cooking, the wood, the daily pump run to the yard. The work was harder than Eliza had imagined, which was saying something because she hadn't imagined it was going to be easy. The soil below 6 feet turned heavy and resistant, and the wooden bucket they used to haul the loosened dirt up was the kind of tedious, repetitive labor that made her understand why Thomas Calloway had started the job in spring and still hadn't finished by July. But Hazel knew things she hadn't learned from books. She knew how her father had read the soil, knew the specific blue-gray clay he'd noted in his journals, could identify it by texture and color when they hit it at 9 feet on the third day of digging. She went down herself and crouched at the bottom of the shaft and pressed her palm flat against the clay layer. "This is it," she called up. "Same as he described. You can feel the cold coming through it." Eliza was at the top of the shaft. "Cold from the clay or cold from water?" A pause. "Both, I think." On the 5th day they hit water. Not a trickle, not a seep. A genuine surge that came up through a fracture in the clay layer and filled the bottom of the shaft faster than Eliza had ever seen in the 2 surface wells she'd helped dig years ago in Missouri. She was down in the shaft herself when it happened, and the water came in around her boots, and she stood very still, her hand on the stone wall, and looked at what Thomas Calloway had given his life to find. "Eliza!" Hazel's voice came down from above. "It's here," Eliza called back. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It's here, Hazel." There was a moment of silence from above. Then, "How much?" She looked at the rising water around her ankles. "A lot." She heard Hazel exhale, long and slow, the kind of exhale that's been held in for months. Then, "Pa was right." "Your father was right," Eliza said. She stood in the cold water at the bottom of the well and thought about a man writing in a composition notebook by lamplight, writing down what he found, hiding it behind a chimney, riding to the territorial capital to get documents notarized, coming home and not saying anything so his daughters wouldn't worry, trying to do it right, trying to do it carefully. She thought about Silas Granger pointing at the east field and saying things that Thomas Calloway answered in a quiet voice. She got herself up out of the shaft and sat on the edge with her boots dripping and her hands shaking slightly from cold and exertion. Hazel was crouching across from her, looking at the water visible below. May had come out of the barn at some point and was standing a few feet back, watching. "May," Eliza said, "go get your sister." May ran. Clara appeared in the barn doorway a few moments later, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Eliza's wet boots, then at Hazel's face, then at the well. She walked over slowly and stood at the edge and looked down. The water was rising visibly, clear, cold, unmistakable. Clara looked at it for a long time. Then she reached down and touched the stone edge of the well with 2 fingers, just briefly, the way you touch something you want to make sure is real. She didn't say anything, but she looked up at Eliza and held eye contact for longer than she had managed in the entire 11 days they'd been living together in this barn, on this ruined property, in this valley, where someone had decided Thomas Calloway knew too much to be allowed to keep knowing it. Eliza held her gaze and nodded, just once. 3 days after that, trouble announced itself with the sound of a horse coming up the ranch road at a pace that wasn't neighborly. Eliza was in the yard splitting wood when she heard it. She set down the axe and shaded her eyes against the flat winter light and watched a rider come around the bend in the road. A big man on a gray horse, the kind of man who takes up space without trying. He slowed when he reached the gate and looked at the barn and the yard and the burned ruin of the house. And then he looked at Eliza. "Miss Rowan," he said. Not a question. "That's right." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope and held it out over the fence. He didn't dismount. "From the county tax office. Amos Greer delivers the official notices. You've been notified." She crossed the yard and took the envelope and opened it there in front of him without going inside because she wasn't going to let him watch her walk away. The notice was for back taxes of $112, due within 30 days, plus a land use fee of $22 that she didn't recognize from any of the paperwork she'd signed at Finch's office. She looked up at the writer. "What's the land use fee for?" "Water access assessment," he said. He had a flat practice neutrality on his face that told her this wasn't the first time he'd delivered a notice someone had questions about. "Everyone in the valley pays it now. I wasn't charged it when I took on the deed." He shrugged, just slightly. "Effective this quarter." She looked at him steadily. "Who authorized this assessment?" The man shifted his weight in the saddle. "That'd be the county commissioner's office, which answers to Magistrate Granger." The neutrality on his face didn't change exactly, but something moved behind it. Not guilt, but the particular discomfort of a person who is doing a job they have decided not to think too hard about. "I just deliver the notices, ma'am." "I understand," Eliza said. "Thank you." He turned the horse and rode back down the road. She stood in the cold yard and looked at the numbers on the paper. $134. She had 29 left. She went inside the barn and found Hazel watching her from across the room. "How bad?" Hazel asked. Eliza folded the notice. "We need to talk." Guts. They talked that night, after May was asleep, the three of them, Eliza and Hazel and Clara, sitting around the stove. She laid it out plainly, the taxes, the amount, the timeline, and what she understood about who was behind the assessment and why. "He knows," Hazel said. It wasn't a question. "He knows someone's here now who isn't going to leave," Eliza said. "I don't know yet if he knows about the journals, but he knows the land has value." "We could sell," Hazel said. She said it carefully, like she was offering it as a possibility rather than a preference. "We could take what we could get and go somewhere else." "Is that what you want?" Hazel was quiet for a moment. "No." "Then we don't sell." Eliza looked at both of them. "But I want to be honest with you. What your father found, and what he documented, is enough to cause Granger real trouble if it gets to the right people. The notarized records show fraud. The reservoir proves the motive. But getting that to the right people means getting to the territorial capital, which is 2 days hard travel, and it means leaving you here alone for however long that takes." Clara, who had been sitting with her knees drawn up, said quietly, "How long?" It was the most direct question she'd asked Eliza yet. 4 or 5 days minimum," Eliza said. "Maybe a week?" Clara looked at Hazel. Something passed between them. One of those silent sister conversations that happen too quickly and too completely for outsiders to follow. "We stayed here before," Clara said, "after the fire. Until Mrs. Osgood came." "I know. We can stay again." Eliza looked at her. This quiet girl who was afraid of strangers and liked small spaces and had been the one to find the tin box because she noticed things other people walked past. "I'm not going right away. I need to get the water documented first. I need to be able to prove what's in this well." "How do you prove a well?" "I find someone who knows what they're looking at. A surveyor, maybe, or someone from the Territorial Land Office." She paused. "And I need to talk to Mrs. Pratt." Hazel looked up. "Why her?" "Because she knew where to look when she suggested this property," Eliza said. "And because she left us food and told us to come find her if we were in trouble." She paused. "I think she knows more than she said. I think she's been waiting to see whether we'd last long enough to be worth knowing more." Hazel considered that. Then, "She came to the funeral. She was the only person outside the immediate neighbors who did." "Thomas Calloway's funeral?" "Yes. She stood at the back and she didn't speak to anyone." Hazel's voice was careful. "Ma noticed. She said afterward that she didn't know Mrs. Pratt well, but she'd always thought she was the kind of woman who saw things clearly." Eliza thought about a steel-haired woman at the back of a funeral, standing apart, watching, seeing things clearly. "I'll go see her tomorrow," she said. "Or..." She went in the morning, alone, riding the borrowed bay horse into Iron Creek in the thin, early winter light. She found Mrs. Pratt's house on the western edge of town, a small, well-kept place with a garden that had been put to bed properly for the season, and a porch that had a good chair on it, the kind you buy because you intend to sit and think. Mrs. Pratt opened the door before Eliza knocked, which suggested she'd been watching the road. "I wondered when you'd come," the old woman said. She stood back to let Eliza in. The inside of the house was clean and spare, a bookshelf on one wall, a work table covered in papers. Mrs. Pratt poured coffee without asking if Eliza wanted it and set it in front of her at the kitchen table and sat across from her with her own cup and looked at her the way she'd looked at her in the council meeting. Direct, assessing, not unkind. "We found the well," Eliza said. Mrs. Pratt nodded slowly. "Thomas always said he'd find it. You knew him. For years, before Granger's people made it socially complicated to be friends with someone who was asking the wrong questions." She set her cup down. "Did you find the journals too?" "Yes." Mrs. Pratt exhaled through her nose. It sounded like relief. "He told me he'd hidden them somewhere fireproof. He didn't say where." She looked at Eliza steadily. "How much did you read?" "All of it." "Then you understand what we're dealing with." "I understand that Granger has been running a fraud scheme on the water rights for 3 years, and that Thomas Calloway was the only person who managed to document it, Eliza said. I understand that Thomas Calloway is dead. She paused. What I don't understand is why nobody else has done anything about it. Mrs. Pratt wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment. Fear, she said finally. Granger doesn't threaten people directly. He doesn't have to. He controls the water assessments, which means he controls who can run cattle and who can't. He controls the mill contracts. He controls the county commissioner's office. She paused. People have families. People have debts. People have decided it's easier to pay what he asks and keep their heads down. But you haven't. I'm old, Mrs. Pratt said. I've already lost most of what he could take, and I've been waiting for someone to come along who had less to lose than sense. She looked at Eliza. You took on 3 orphan children and a burned homestead. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, Eliza said. Something shifted in Mrs. Pratt's face. Not quite a smile, but close. Yes, probably both. She stood and went to the bookshelf and came back with a folded document that she laid flat on the table between them. I've been holding on to this for 3 months. I didn't know who to give it to. Thomas brought it to me the week before the fire because he needed someone outside the county to have a copy. Eliza unfolded it. It was another notarized copy, different from the one in the tin, but related. A deed amendment from 2 years ago, with the same pattern Thomas had noted in his journals. The original subsurface rights language replaced with a transfer clause in the amended version. This is the Hennessy property, Mrs. Pratt said. They sold last winter. Took a price that seemed fair at the time. They didn't know they'd already lost the water rights 6 months before Granger approached them to buy. Eliza stared at the document. He's been stripping the water rights first, then buying the land at depressed prices. For 3 years, at least. Mrs. Pratt sat back down. The reservoir under the Calloway property is the largest in the valley. Thomas believed it connected to subsurface aquifers running the length of the ridge. Whoever controls that water controls everything in this valley for the next 50 years. Eliza sat with that for a moment. Then, I need to get to the territorial capital. Yes, you do. I need someone to document the well first, someone official. There's a land surveyor out of Miller's Crossing who's not under Granger's thumb. His name is Ben Cutter. He owes me a favor. She said it with the dry matter-of-factness of a woman who has spent decades building the kind of relationships that are useful when things go wrong. I'll send word today. And while I'm gone, Eliza stopped. The girls, Mrs. Pratt said. Yes. I'll look in on them. I'll also send my neighbor's son, Caleb, he's 17 and capable, to stay nearby in case anyone decides to apply pressure while you're traveling. She looked at Eliza steadily. Granger's going to find out you've been digging. He may already know. I know. This isn't going to be easy. I know that too. Mrs. Pratt picked up her coffee cup. She looked out the window at the pale winter light on the street outside. Thomas Calloway was a good man who did things the right way, and it wasn't enough, she said quietly. I hope you're a different kind of problem. Eliza looked at the document spread on the table between them. The careful, stubborn evidence of a dead man who had seen something true and written it down and hidden it and ridden to the capital and still not managed to survive long enough to use it. I'm going to try to be, she said. She picked up the documents and folded them carefully and put them inside her coat, next to the copies from the tin box, next to her own heart, which was beating faster than she'd have preferred, but beating steadily. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, the kind of wind that meant real winter was coming. She had 30 days until the taxes were due, $29 to her name, and a well full of water that a man had died to find. It was going to have to be enough. Ben Cutter arrived on a Wednesday, 2 days after Mrs. Pratt sent word, riding a mule that looked older than both of them combined, and carrying a leather satchel of surveying equipment that clinked and rattled with every step the mule took up the ranch road. He was a short man, maybe 55, with a white beard that he kept trimmed close and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years looking at things through instruments. He introduced himself to Eliza with a handshake that was brief and businesslike, and then immediately wanted to see the well, which she appreciated. Hazel showed him. She walked him to the east field and stood at the edge of the shaft and told him what her father had noted at each depth: the clay layer, the fracture point, the rate of the initial surge. She had the second notebook in her hand and read from it when her memory needed backing up. Cutter crouched at the well's edge and looked down and asked Hazel 2 questions about the soil composition and one about the direction of the ridge drainage, and she answered all 3. He looked at her sideways afterward. "How old are you?" 13, Hazel said. "Your father teach you this?" "Some. The rest I figured out." Cutter looked back at the well. He lowered a measuring line, took readings, made notes in his own small book. He walked the perimeter of the east field with a device Eliza didn't recognize, stopping every few yards, crouching, standing again. It took the better part of the morning. At noon they sat on the fence rail near the yard and ate the bread and salt beef Eliza had brought out, and Cutter looked at the land around them with an expression that was harder to read than most. "Thomas Calloway was right," he said finally. "The subsurface formation here is consistent with a substantial confined aquifer, not just a pocket, a connected system. If it runs along the ridge the way his notes suggest, the water yield from this property alone could supply the whole northern valley in a dry year." Eliza looked at him. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I wouldn't want to put my name on paper saying otherwise." He paused. "I've seen Granger's water assessment reports. I saw them 2 years ago when they started making the rounds. I knew they were wrong then. The geology doesn't support the conclusion that the valley water table is exhausted. I said so to one person and was told very clearly that I was mistaken." He said the last word with a flatness that indicated he had not, in fact, been mistaken. "Granger told you that?" "His land commissioner did. Finch." He glanced at her. "The young one with the ink-stained fingers." Eliza thought of Rudolph Finch sitting across his desk from her, reading the deed transfer for the 4th time. "Do you actually know what you're doing?" he'd asked. And when she'd said no, he'd stamped the deed without further comment. "Is Finch part of it?" she asked. Cutter was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. He might be in it deliberately. He might be doing what he's told because he needs the job. There's more of the second kind than people like to admit." He looked at his notes. "What matters right now is the documentation. I'll write up a formal survey assessment. That's what you need for the Territorial Land Office. It needs to reference Thomas Calloway's original notes and corroborate the geological findings. How long will that take?" "I can have a draft done tonight if I stay, which I'm willing to do." "There's room in the barn," Eliza said. She paused. It's a barn," Cutter said. "I've slept in worse." But Cutter stayed 2 nights. He slept in the loft and worked by lamp until late each evening, and on the second morning he came down from the loft with 12 pages of formal survey documentation and a hand-drawn geological cross-section that showed the aquifer formation beneath the Calloway property in the kind of careful, credentialed detail that was hard to argue with in front of people who made decisions based on paper. He gave the documents to Eliza at the barn door with the mule already saddled behind him. "The Territorial Land Office is in Harmon City," he said, 2 days' ride southwest. "You want the Division of Natural Resources. Ask for the director or his deputy, not the front desk. Front desk loses things." He paused. "There's a territorial judge named Harlan Moss who's been on the bench for 20 years and hasn't been bought yet. If you can get an audience with him as well, do it." "How do I get an audience with a territorial judge?" "You walk in and you ask for one, and you don't leave until they give you a time." He looked at her steadily. "You seem like someone who's capable of that." She tucked the survey documents into the satchel she'd been assembling over the past 2 days. Cutter's survey, Thomas Calloway's notarized copies, Mrs. Pratt's deed amendment, the composition notebooks, a letter she'd written herself laying out the timeline of events as she understood them in the plainest language she could manage. Everything together made a packet about 1 inch thick that she'd wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord. "One more thing," Cutter said. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded card. "This is the name of a man who keeps a room at the boarding house in Harmon City. He's a correspondent for the territorial newspaper. His name is Walt Deering. If the land office and the judge both turn you away, which they won't, but give him what you have. He can't fix it legally, but he can make it very uncomfortable for people to keep ignoring it." Eliza looked at the card. "You've thought about this before." I thought about it 2 years ago when I should have done something about it, Cutter said. I didn't. I talked myself out of it. He picked up the mule's reins. I'm not in a position to fix that, but I can help you not make the same mistake. He rode off down the ranch road without looking back. Eliza stood in the yard and watched him go, and then went inside to tell the girls she was leaving in the morning. The conversation was harder than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected it to be easy. May cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. She sat at the edge of her hay pallet and cried with her face turned down and her hands in her lap and didn't make a sound, which was somehow worse than if she'd wailed. Eliza sat next to her and put an arm around her and felt the smallness of her shoulders, all that were packed into such a small frame. I'll be back in a week, Eliza said. Maybe less. You don't know that, May said, into her own lap. You're right. I don't know exactly, but I know I'm coming back. Pa said he'd be home for supper. May wiped her face with the back of her hand. He was just going to the east field. Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't a good answer to that. She just kept her arm around May's shoulders and let the silence be what it was. Hazel was the one who got practical about it, the way Hazel got practical about most things that hurt. She channeled it directly into logistics. She wanted to know the route, the timing, what to do if someone came to the property while Eliza was gone, whether Caleb from Mrs. Pratt's neighbor's farm would actually show up, what to do if the pump froze again. Eliza answered everything she could. She went over the emergency money she'd set aside, $7 in a tin under the hay, enough for food if something went wrong. She went over the documents she was leaving copies of, because she'd spent the previous evening making hand-copied duplicates of the most critical papers with Hazel's help, hiding them in the same chimney gap where the original tin had been. If anyone comes and starts asking questions or trying to pressure you, Eliza said, you don't know anything. You're 3 girls living in a barn. You don't know what your father found. You don't know anything about any journals. You've never heard of any water survey. Hazel nodded. Can you do that? I've been keeping a straight face my whole life, Hazel said. Yes. Clara had been quiet through most of this. She was sitting on the other side of the stove, mending in her lap, not looking up. Eliza looked at her for a long moment. Clara? The girl looked up. You found the tin box. You saw what was in it. You understand what I'm going to do with it. Clara nodded once. If something goes wrong while I'm gone, if someone comes here who frightens you, if something happens that feels dangerous, you take May and Hazel and you go to Mrs. Pratt. You go directly there and you don't stop for anything. Another nod. Do you know the way? I walked it once, Clara said quietly, with Hazel last fall. Good. Eliza looked at all 3 of them. I need you to hold things together here. I know that's a lot to ask. It's not, Hazel said. It is. I know it is. I'm asking anyway. Hazel looked at her with those steady, 2 old eyes. Go, she said. We'll be here when you come back. So she left before first light on a Friday morning, riding a horse she'd borrowed from Mrs. Pratt, a sturdy roan mare named Bess who had the slightly annoyed temperament of a horse that knew its own mind and tolerated human plans as long as they were reasonable. The oilcloth packet was in the saddlebag. Cutter's survey was on top. The road south out of Iron Creek was better than the northern road to the ranch, which wasn't saying much. It was wagon-rutted and river-crossed and ran through 2 passes that were cold enough in mid-November to make her grateful for the wool coat she'd packed. She rode hard the first day and covered more ground than she'd expected, reaching the first way station, a single-room trading post called Ardell's, by late afternoon. Ardell himself was a big, taciturn man who sold her a bowl of something hot and a place to sleep on a bench for 50 cents and asked no questions, which was exactly what she needed. She lay on the bench in the dark and listened to the fire settle and thought about what she was going to say when she got to Harmon City. She'd been composing it in her head for days. The argument, the sequence, the way to make people who dealt in abstractions like land law and regulatory oversight understand that what had happened to Thomas Calloway had happened and was still happening and needed to stop. She was not a lawyer. She was not from this territory. She had no money, no connections, no husband, no official position of any kind. She had a packet of documents and a dead man's notebooks, and the testimony of an old woman who'd kept a copy of something she shouldn't have had, and a land surveyor who'd admitted he'd done nothing when he should have. She thought, It will have to be enough, because it's what there is. She slept fitfully and was back on the road before Ardell lit his morning lamp. Wharton. Harmon City was larger than she'd expected. A proper territorial capital with paved streets in the center and a courthouse that took up most of one block, stone-faced and solid in the way that buildings are when they're designed to communicate permanence. There were telegraph wires and a proper hotel and a newspaper office on the main street whose windows were plastered with the previous week's headlines. She went to the Division of Natural Resources first because Cutter had said to. The building was on the side street off the courthouse square, a two-story wood frame affair with a sign that needed repainting. Inside there was a front desk staffed by a young man who told her the director was not available and the deputy was in a meeting, and perhaps if she left her name and the nature of her inquiry, she could be contacted in due course. She left her name. She did not leave the building. She sat on a bench in the front hall for 2 hours. She watched 3 different men go in and out of the back offices. She watched the front desk clerk glance at her 3 times with increasing unease and say nothing. At the end of the second hour, a woman came through from the back offices, middle-aged, efficient-looking, carrying a stack of files. She stopped when she saw Eliza. "You've been here for a while," the woman said. 2 hours, Eliza said. "My name is Eliza Rowan. I've come from Iron Creek with documentation of a fraudulent land and water rights scheme that has been operating in Larimer County for at least 3 years. I believe it involves falsified deed amendments and may be connected to 2 deaths. I'd like to speak to whoever can actually do something about it." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the front desk clerk, who was watching this with the expression of someone watching a situation he'd failed to prevent unfold. "Come with me," the woman said. Her name was Margaret Hale, and she was the deputy director's administrative secretary, and it turned out the person who actually decided which matters reached the deputy director's desk and which got filed in the back room and forgotten. She brought Eliza into a small office and sat across from her and listened while Eliza laid out the documents and talked through what she knew. Eliza had told this story enough times in her own head that it came out in the right order. She didn't editorialize. She said what Thomas Calloway had found and documented. She said what the land record showed. She said what Cutter's survey confirmed. She said that a man and his wife were dead, that their 3 daughters were living in a barn, and that the person responsible for the fraudulent amendments was still in his office in Iron Creek, making sure that no one in Larimer County was able to challenge him. Margaret Hale had read the deed comparison documents carefully while Eliza talked. She turned the notarized copy over and looked at the back as if there might be something useful there. She held Cutter's survey up toward the window light. When Eliza finished, Hale was quiet for a moment. Then, "These notarized copies, you said Thomas Calloway obtained them himself?" "Yes, he rode here in June." "Do you know who the notary was?" Eliza had the name. She found it in the packet and pointed to it. Hale looked at it, and her expression shifted very slightly. Not alarm exactly, but recognition. "I know that name," Hale said. She set the documents down. "He died in August." Eliza went still. "He died?" "Yes, cholera," they said. Hale said it carefully, in the tone of someone marking that they were saying what they were told, and not necessarily what they believed. She looked at Eliza steadily. "I want to show these to the deputy director today, this afternoon if I can make it happen. Will you stay?" "Yes." "The hotel on the main street, tell them Margaret Hale sent you and they'll give you a room without too much argument about rates." She stood and began to gather the documents, then stopped. "Leave me the originals and keep your copies close. Don't leave them anywhere you can't get to quickly." Eliza looked at her. "You've seen something like this before." "Not exactly like this," Hale said, "but I've seen how these things go when they go wrong." She met Eliza's eyes without looking away. "You were right to come here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But the deputy director's name was Arthur Sen, and he was a tired-looking man of about 60 who had the permanently slightly rumpled quality of someone who'd been doing a difficult job for too long without quite enough help. He received Eliza in his office that same afternoon, with Hale present taking notes at the small desk in the corner. He read the documents himself. He asked 3 questions, all precise, all aimed at the specific legal machinery of the fraud, how the amendments had been filed, through which county office, On what authority? Eliza answered what she could and referred him to the documents for the rest. When he was done reading, Sen took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on and looked at the documents again. The falsification of subsurface water rights and deed amendments is a territorial criminal matter, he said, in the tone of a man who is confirming what he already knows while making sure someone else also knows it. If these amendments were filed as described, through the county commissioner's office, then the officer who authorized them is potentially liable for fraud. The beneficiary of the fraudulent transfers is also potentially liable. Silas Granger, Eliza said, if the evidence points there. He looked at her. It appears to point there. What happens next? Sen looked at Hale. Something passed between them. The quick practice communication of people who have worked together long enough to have a shorthand. I can authorize a suspension of any current land seizure proceedings against the Callaway property pending investigation, Sen said. That would give you protection against any move Granger makes on the taxes or the property rights while this is being reviewed. There's a tax notice with 30 days on it. That was 12 days ago. Then we'll move quickly. He stood. I'll also need to notify the territorial attorney's office. This is beyond what my division handles alone. He paused. And Miss Rowan, I'd recommend you speak to Judge Moss while you're here. He has jurisdiction over Larimer County, and he'll need to be aware of any suspension order. I was already intending to, Eliza said. Sen looked at her for a moment with the same expression Cutter had worn when she'd said she was going to stay in that front hall until someone talked to her. Not quite admiration, exactly. Something more measured than that. The recognition of a person who has decided to do something and is actually doing it. Good, he said simply. She saw Judge Harlan Moss the following morning. Getting the appointment had required an hour in the courthouse anteroom and a conversation with his bailiff that was politely immovable on both sides, until Eliza asked the bailiff to deliver a specific message, that she had notarized evidence of fraudulent land records from Larimer County, and that if the judge preferred, she could deliver it to the territorial newspaper instead. But she had understood he was the appropriate authority. The bailiff was back in 6 minutes. Judge Moss was a tall man who'd gone stringy with age and had a face like weathered limestone, hard, colorless, and durable. He sat across his desk from Eliza and listened without interrupting while she made the same presentation she'd made to Sen, because she'd learned by now what needed to be said and in what order, and she'd gotten efficient at it. When she finished, Moss looked at the documents for a long time. Rudolph Finch is the land commissioner who processed these amendments, he said. Yes, I don't know how much he knows. I've met Finch, Moss said. He was placed in that office 18 months ago. Before that, it was a man named Carver who retired rather abruptly. He said rather abruptly the way people say things when they mean I've always thought that was suspicious. He continued looking at the documents. Silas Granger and I have had 3 conversations in the past 2 years about matters relating to county land administration. I found them unremarkable at the time. I'm finding them less unremarkable now. Eliza said nothing. Moss looked up at her. You've also seen Deputy Director Sen. Yesterday afternoon. Did he give you a suspension order? He said he'd prepare one. Moss was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up a pen and wrote something on a separate sheet of paper and signed it and blotted it and handed it across the desk to her. That's a judicial notice of inquiry, he said. It supersedes any county-level land action in Larimer County pending the investigation Sen will be opening. It also requires the Larimer County Commissioner's Office, which is Granger's direct jurisdiction, to preserve all land records from the past 5 years without modification. She read it quickly. It was 12 lines long and had his signature and his seal. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Get back to Iron Creek before someone decides to make things difficult before that notice can be served. He looked at her steadily. You have 3 days before word travels back, maybe 4. After that, you're in a race. She was already on her feet. She got back on Bess and rode. The return trip was harder than the outward journey because the weather had shifted while she was in Harmon City. The warm respite of the past week had closed down, and a real winter cold was moving in from the northwest, the kind that hit the ridge passes first. She rode through the first pass on the afternoon of the 3rd day, with sleet coming sideways off the ridge, her coat plastered flat against her and Bess moving with her head down in the particular way horses have when they're working hard and deeply unhappy about it. She talked to the horse. Not meaningful conversation, just steady, low talk to fill the silence and keep them both focused. She told Bess about the girls. She told her about the barn and the stove and the well and the documents in the satchel. She told her about Thomas Calloway writing in his notebook in June, careful and methodical, going to get things notarized because he understood that the truth needed a witness and an official seal if it was going to survive. The notary had died in August. She thought about that on and off through the second pass, the timing of it. Cholera, they said. The dead man's documents had still been in the Territorial Archive, which was perhaps why Thomas Calloway had filed them there instead of keeping them. Because a notary could die, but the archive was harder to burn than a house. She cleared the second pass at dusk and made camp at the base of it, under a rock overhang that kept the worst of the sleet off. She fed Bess from the saddlebag grain she'd brought and ate dried beef and thought about the judicial notice folded in her coat pocket, close to her body for warmth. 3 days, Moss had said. Maybe 4. She'd used 3 getting back to the base of the pass. 1 more day's hard riding to Iron Creek. She slept in 2-hour pieces and was riding again before dawn. She came up the ranch road on the afternoon of the 4th day, and everything looked the same from a distance. The gray barn, the stone chimney, the flat winter sky pressing down on the ridge above. She let out a breath she'd been holding since the second pass and urged Bess up the road. Hazel was in the yard splitting wood, and she looked up at the sound of the horse with an expression that went through 3 things in very quick succession: relief, then careful neutrality, then back to the flat practicality that was her baseline. She set down the axe. "You're back," she said. "I'm back." Eliza dismounted, her legs stiff and unreliable after 4 days of hard riding. She grabbed the saddle with one hand and waited for her knees to agree to work properly. "Everything all right?" "Mostly." Hazel came to take Bess's reins. "Caleb's been here every day, like Mrs. Pratt said. He fixed the fence on the north side that was coming down." She paused. 2 men came 3 days ago." Eliza went still. "What men?" "I don't know their names. One of them did the talking. He said he was from the county tax office, but he wasn't Amos Greer." Hazel was looking at the horse rather than at Eliza, in the careful way she looked at things when what she was saying was harder than her tone suggested. "He said the tax notice had been accelerated, that the 30 days had been reduced to 15. Can they do that?" "I don't know. He said it was a provision in the County Emergency Assessment Code." Hazel paused. "Clara was in the root cellar. May was in the barn. I was the only one out here. I told him I'd pass the message along." "He believed you?" "He did not believe me. He looked at the well, though. He stood there for a while and looked at it." Hazel finally looked at Eliza. "He knew we'd been digging." "Of course he did. Someone would have watched the road. Someone in Iron Creek knew what day Cutter had ridden out to the property, and they would have told someone else, and the information would have worked its way to whoever was listening for it." "When was this?" Eliza asked. 3 days ago." Eliza did the arithmetic. If the 15 days had started from the original notice date, they had maybe 2 days left. If it started from when the accelerated notice had been served, maybe 5. She pulled the oilcloth packet from the saddlebag and untied the cord, and found the judicial notice and unfolded it and looked at it again, the 12 lines in Moss's handwriting with his seal. "I got what I went for," she said. Hazel looked at the document. She couldn't read the legal language quickly, but she looked at the seal and the signature, and something in her shoulders came down by about half an inch. A minute loosening that, on Hazel, was the equivalent of someone else collapsing in relief. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It should suspend any seizure action while the investigation is opened." Eliza folded the document back. "But I need to get it to the council, to Keach, before Granger moves on the property. If he doesn't know yet that I went to the Capitol, he will soon. And if he decides to move quickly, when do you go?" "Tomorrow morning. First thing." Hazel nodded. She took Bess's reins and started toward the barn, then stopped without turning around. "May asked about you every day," she said. 3 times on the second day." "I'll go tell her I'm back." "I know." A pause. "She made you something. A corn husk thing. It looks like a person if you look at it from the right angle." Eliza almost smiled. "I'll look at it from the right angle then." That evening was the quietest she'd had in a week. The stove was going, the lamp was lit, and the four of them sat in the barn together the way they'd been doing for the past month. And it felt, in the particular way that temporary things sometimes feel, like something she wanted to hold on to exactly as it was. May showed her the corn husk figure. It did look like a person if you tilted your head and used some imagination. Eliza said so, and May looked extremely pleased. Clara had made a pot of beans while Eliza was gone, working from memory and the dried supplies in the root cellar. They ate them for supper with the last of the bread, and it was the best thing Eliza had tasted in 4 days, which said something both about the food and about the state she'd come back in. "Tell us what happened," May said. "All of it. Start from when you got to the city." So Eliza told them. She told them about Margaret Hale and Deputy Director Sen and the long wait in the front hall. She told them about Judge Moss and the bailiff and the 12-line notice with the official seal. She told them about Cutter's documentation and how it had been the thing that made it real. Not just a dead man's notebooks, but a credentialed professional saying, in language that officials could act on, "Yes, this is what it is. Yes, this is what it means." Hazel listened with her arms crossed, asking occasional precise questions. Clara listened with that still, complete attention she gave to things that mattered. May listened with her mouth open and her eyes wide, and at one point said, "She talked to a real judge?" in a tone that suggested this was the most dramatic thing she'd ever heard, which Eliza supposed it might have been. When Eliza finished, the barn was quiet for a moment. "So tomorrow you go to Keech," Hazel said. "Yes. And then?" "And then we see what happens." Eliza looked at the lamp. "Granger's not just going to stop because a judge signed a piece of paper. He's going to push back. He has money and connections, and everyone in this county owes him something or is afraid of him." She paused. "But so far the only thing he's had going for him is that nobody had the documentation to contradict him. Now someone does." "We do," May said. Eliza looked at her. "Yes," she said. "We do." She did not say what she was also thinking, which was, this is the part where it gets worse before it gets better. She'd learned enough about how power worked, not from any particular experience, but from paying attention over 31 years to how things went when a person with nothing tried to go up against a person with a great deal. To know that having the right documents wasn't the same as winning. It was just the thing that made winning possible. The rest depended on what other people decided to do when the moment arrived. That part she couldn't control. She'd done what she could do, and she'd get up tomorrow and do the next thing that needed doing, and she'd find out what the town of Iron Creek was made of. She banked the stove and turned down the lamp, and outside the wind moved along the ridge in the dark, and underneath the frozen earth below the east field, the water waited, patient and indifferent. The way water always waits, cold and clear, and entirely uninterested in what the people above it decided to do about it. She rode into Iron Creek the next morning with the judicial notice in her coat pocket and the cold working its way through every layer she had on. And the first thing she saw when she came down the main street was that something was already wrong. There were more horses than usual tied at the rail outside the council hall. The blue door was standing open, which it never did in winter. 2 men she didn't recognize were posted on either side of it, with the particular stillness of men who have been told to stand somewhere and make their presence known. She slowed Bess to a walk and took in the street as she came down it. The hardware store was open but empty. Mrs. Alderman's dress shop had the shade pulled despite it being past 9 in the morning. The barber was standing in his doorway with his arms crossed, watching the council hall, the way you watch something you're worried about but haven't decided whether to involve yourself in. Eliza pulled up at the rail and dismounted and tied Bess alongside the other horses. One of the men at the door looked at her. She looked back. "Council meeting?" she said. "Special session," the man said. "Closed to the public." "I'm a property holder in Larimer County," she said. "That makes it my business." "Ma'am, whose authority are you standing on?" The man's jaw tightened. He was maybe 35, thick through the shoulders, with the look of someone who took wages from whoever offered them. Magistrate Granger requested a special session. The council agreed. "Then the council can tell me I'm not welcome," she said. "Step aside." He didn't, quite. But he also didn't physically stop her, and she walked past him through the blue door and into the council hall before he could decide what to do about it. The room was fuller than the Thursday meeting had been. The 5 council members were at the front table, and there were maybe 30 people on the benches. more than she'd seen at a regular session. Harmon Keech was at the center of the table with papers in front of him and a look on his face like a man who has agreed to something he's increasingly uncomfortable about. The other council members had varying degrees of the same expression. At the far end of the room, standing, rather than sitting, was a man she hadn't seen before. He was perhaps 60, broad across the chest, with iron gray hair and the kind of clothing that cost money without advertising it. Good wool coat, good boots, nothing flashy, everything made to last. He had the particular stillness of someone who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in a room and no longer needed to demonstrate it. Silas Granger, she understood, without anyone telling her. He was looking at a document he held, and he was talking to Keech, and the conversation stopped when the door opened behind her. Every head in the room turned. Granger looked up. She had imagined this moment in various ways over the past 2 weeks. She had imagined herself calm, or frightened, or righteous. She was, in fact, none of those things precisely. She was tired in her bones from 4 days of hard riding, and the particular tightly wound state of someone who has been running on purpose and necessity and has not quite let herself feel how much either of those things cost. She walked down the center aisle and didn't look at Granger yet. She looked at Keech. "I need a moment before this session proceeds," she said. Keech blinked at her. "Miss Rowan, this is a special session on the matter of the Callaway land." "I know." She reached into her coat and took out the judicial notice and unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of Keech. "This is a judicial notice of inquiry from Judge Harlan Moss, Territorial Bench, Larimer County jurisdiction. It supersedes any county-level land action pending a formal investigation opened by the Division of Natural Resources in Harmon City." She kept her voice even. "The investigation concerns fraudulent amendments to subsurface water rights and land deeds filed through this county's commissioner office over the past 3 years." The room went very quiet. She heard Keech's breathing change. He picked up the document and read it, and she watched his face as he read. The careful blankness giving way to something she couldn't name precisely, some mixture of relief and complicated worry. From the far end of the room, Granger said, "I don't see how a routine tax matter—" "This isn't a routine tax matter," Eliza said. She turned and looked at him for the first time. Up close, he was less impressive and more dangerous than she'd expected. There was intelligence behind his eyes, the patient, calculating kind. He was a man who planned. He was looking at her now the way you look at something you've underestimated and are recalibrating around. The accelerated tax notice issued 12 days ago is part of a pattern of pressure on the Callaway property. That property sits above a substantial underground aquifer, the same aquifer whose subsurface rights have been fraudulently stripped from 11 other properties in this valley through deed amendments authorized by your county commissioner's office. Granger said, "That's a serious allegation." "It's a documented one." She looked back at Keech. "I have Ben Cutter's geological survey confirming the aquifer's existence and extent. I have Thomas Callaway's notarized discovery records from June, filed in the Territorial Archive. I have a deed comparison showing the original subsurface language and the amended version, with the alterations marked and notarized." She had kept her voice as flat and factual as she could manage, because she understood instinctively that this room full of people had been afraid for years and would be more moved by legal fact than by her anger, which was real, but beside the point. "All of that is now in the hands of Deputy Director Sen and Judge Moss. The Callaway property cannot be seized, taxed, or transferred pending the investigation. That's what the notice says." Keech was still looking at the document. Around him, the other council members were looking at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to something closer to stunned. From the back of the room, Gerald Moody said, "Harmon, you need to—" "I can read, Gerald," Keech said, without looking up. His voice had changed. Something in it had settled or decided. He set the notice down on the table in front of him and smoothed it flat with one hand. "This meeting is in recess." Granger did not leave. He stood at the end of the room while the people on the benches shifted and murmured, and some of them stood and some of them stayed sitting. And he looked at Eliza across the length of the hall with an expression that was not angry, precisely. It was the expression of someone recalculating. "Miss Rowan," he said. He had a voice that was well controlled. Not loud, but it carried without effort. "You've made some very specific claims this morning." She faced him across the room. She was aware of the 30 people between them, all very still, all listening. Everything I said is documented. Documentation can be questioned. Surveys can be challenged. A territorial inquiry can take years. He said it pleasantly, like he was offering information rather than making a threat. In the meantime, the Callaway property remains in debt. The girls who live on it remain minors. A woman who arrived in this town 6 weeks ago with no local standing and no means of support remains their guardian. He paused. That's a fragile situation. It was more fragile before I went to Harmon City, Eliza said. Investigations are slow, Granger said. Courts are slow. Men in offices in the Capitol make decisions that take time to reach the people they affect. He let that sit. If you're hoping that a piece of paper is going to change how things work in this valley overnight, you may be disappointed. He wasn't wrong about that, and she knew it. He was watching her face for the signs that she knew it. Maybe, she said, but the difference between now and 6 weeks ago is that 6 weeks ago nobody in this room could say out loud what you've been doing. Now they can. She looked around the room. The ranchers, the shopkeepers, the neighbors who'd known Thomas Callaway and had been paying water assessments for 2 years and hadn't understood why. The records exist, the survey exists, the judicial notice exists. You can't burn the territorial archive. Granger said nothing, but she saw it. A small, controlled tightening around his eyes, the first sign that she'd landed something. She turned away from him and looked at the room. I know most of you have been paying assessments you didn't choose. I know most of you signed deed amendments you may not have read closely or didn't understand what the language change meant. She paused. The investigation will look at all of it. Anyone who was deceived is a victim, not a participant. And anyone who wants to speak to what they know, she glanced back at Granger once, has that right, whatever they may have been led to believe. The room was very still. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the benches, a man stood up. His name was Ray Dellum. He ran about 300 head of cattle on the eastern edge of the valley and had the look of someone who'd spent 20 years making hard decisions and carrying them alone. He was maybe 50, with calloused hands and a deliberate quality to his movements. A man who didn't do anything quickly, if he could help it. I want to say something, Dellum said. He wasn't looking at Eliza or at Granger. He was looking at Keach. I signed an amendment 2 years ago. Finch brought the paperwork out to my place personally, said it was a standard water use reclassification required by new county code. He paused. I didn't know what subsurface rights were. I didn't know I was signing them away. The room absorbed this. I found out 6 months ago that I'd lost them, Dellum continued. I went to Finch's office. He told me the amendment was legal and binding and there was no recourse. Another pause. I didn't say anything because I didn't see what good it would do. Keach was looking at him. Ray, I'm telling you now, Dellum said, because she went to Harmon City and I didn't, and I've been feeling poorly about that since she left. He sat down. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then a woman from the back row stood, a rancher's wife named Jessie Pryor, whose family had sold the property 2 years ago that Mrs. Pratt had identified as one of Granger's purchases. She didn't speak at length. She said, My husband signed the same kind of amendment before we sold. We didn't know. Nobody told us. She sat down. From 2 rows behind her, a man named Callum Werner, the owner of the feed store who'd been sitting with his arms crossed since Eliza walked in, uncrossed them and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. I've been keeping 2 sets of records, he said, to no one in particular, as if he were talking himself through a decision rather than making an announcement. Granger's people have been requiring a water tax receipt as a condition for mill contracts. If you don't pay the assessment, you don't get the contract. I have documentation of that going back 18 months. He looked up. I didn't know if it was legal. I kept the records because something about it didn't feel right. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded packet of papers. Someone can have these if they're useful. He held them out, and after a moment Gerald Moody, of all people, stood up from the back row and came forward and took them from his hand. Moody looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy and was putting it down badly, but still putting it down. I've been on the County Water Assessment Committee, Moody said, still holding Werner's papers. He said it to Keach. He didn't look at Granger. I've been on it for 2 years. Some of the things I've approved, I want the record to show that I was given information that I've since come to believe was not accurate. He stopped, cleared his throat. I want to cooperate with whatever investigation comes. Silas Granger had not moved from his position at the end of the room. He was watching this with the controlled, assessing patience of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and is deciding what each development means and what, if anything, he can do about it. After Moody spoke, Granger said, "This is all very dramatic, but testimony at a county council meeting is not evidence. Feelings are not fraud. What any of you believe about what you were told, I have something." The voice came from the front corner of the room, quiet enough that half the room missed it and had to turn to find the source. It was Rudolph Finch. He was standing near the wall beside the council table, not at it, slightly apart from the 5 official members, in the position he always occupied at council meetings, close but not quite included. He was holding a leather portfolio that Eliza recognized from his office, the one he carried his papers in. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Keach looked at him. "Rudolph." "I have the original files," Finch said. His voice was steady but thin, like a thread pulled tight. "The ones before the amendments. I kept copies of every original deed alongside the amended version because—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "Because I told myself it was standard record-keeping practice. But that wasn't the real reason." The room was absolutely silent. "I kept them because something was wrong and I knew it, and I didn't want to be the only one without a record of what I'd been told to do," Finch said. He looked at Granger, and it was the first time he'd looked at him directly since the room went quiet. "I was told the amendments were authorized by county code. I was told the landowners had been notified and had consented to the water rights reclassification." He looked back at Keach. "They hadn't. I found that out after the first 5. By then I had already processed 11. He held out the portfolio. After a moment, Eliza crossed the room and took it from him. He let it go like a man releasing something he'd been holding underwater. She opened it. Inside were filed folders, neat, organized, the work of a meticulous record keeper, each containing an original deed and a photocopy of the amended version, with Finch's own annotations in the margins marking the specific language changes. 11 properties, including the Callaway homestead, including the Hennessy property that Mrs. Pratt had told her about. "Why didn't you come forward?" she asked. She kept her voice even. Finch looked at the floor. "Because he owns the building my mother rents," he said quietly. "Because he has a contract with 3 of the 4 businesses I rely on for my salary supplements. Because I—" He stopped. "Because I was afraid. I don't have a better answer than that." Eliza looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for coming forward now." He didn't look up. But his shoulders came down by about the same degree Hazel's had when she'd shown her the judicial notice. That same small, definitive release. It took another hour for the room to settle into something functional. Keach called the recess properly and asked everyone who had documentation to stay so it could be formally noted. About a third of the room stayed. The other 2/3 left, and Eliza noticed that several of them stopped to speak to each other in the doorway in ways that weren't the usual post-meeting idle talk. Quieter, more deliberate. Granger left without speaking again. He walked out the blue door with the 2 men he'd posted outside falling in on either side of him, and his face as he passed Eliza was still controlled, still calculating, but there was something beneath it now that hadn't been there before. Not panic. He wasn't a man given to panic, but he was reassessing. She could see it. She watched him go and then turned back to the room, which was her job. Mrs. Pratt had appeared at some point during the proceedings. Eliza didn't know exactly when. She'd simply looked up at one point, and the old woman was there, standing near the side wall, watching. When the room began to thin, Mrs. Pratt made her way over with the unhurried movement of someone who has all the time she needs, and not a second more. "You got to Sen," she said. It wasn't a question. "And to Judge Moss." Mrs. Pratt looked at the portfolio in Eliza's hands and then at the papers that Ray Dellum and Jesse Pryor and Callum Werner had added to the growing pile on the council table. "Finch," she said. "Yes." "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "Thomas would be—" she started and then stopped and didn't finish it, because she was not a woman who trafficked in sentiment. She just looked at the table of documents and pressed her lips together briefly. "It's not over," Eliza said. "No, it's not." Mrs. Pratt looked at her. "But it's different than it was this morning." Keach found her near the door an hour later when most of the people had gone and the council members were organizing the documentation in preparation for sending it to the territorial office. "Miss Rowan," he said. He stopped beside her and looked at the room for a moment in the way people look at a room where something significant has just happened. Not quite sure yet what name to give it. "I want to say something." She waited. "I knew something was wrong with the water assessments," he said. "I didn't know the specifics, but I knew. I felt it. For about a year." He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture that made him look suddenly older and considerably less official. "I didn't push because Granger holds the mill contract that 3 of my cousins depend on, and because I didn't have anything concrete, and because it was easier not to." Eliza didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to think better of me for saying so," he continued. "I'm telling you because you're going to need the council to cooperate with the investigation, and I want you to understand what you're working with." He looked at her directly. "I'll do what's required now. I want that noted." "I noted it," she said. He nodded and went back to the table. She walked out the blue door into the cold street and stood for a moment with her back to the building and her face to the sky. The overcast had broken slightly and there were patches of winter blue above the ridge. Bess was still at the rail, patient and slightly offended looking. Eliza took one long breath and let it out slowly. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. They'd been shaking, she realized, for most of the past hour, but so quietly that she'd only just noticed they'd stopped. She thought about the room. Dellum standing up first, then Jesse Pryor, then Werner, then Moody with his careful admission, then Finch most of all. It hadn't been easy for any of them. Dellum had had that look of a man setting down a weight that had been hurting him for a long time. Jessie Pryor had kept her voice flat and her eyes dry with visible effort. Finch had stared at the floor when he handed over the portfolio, and she understood exactly what he'd meant when he'd said he'd kept the copies because he didn't want to be the only one without a record. The record was the thing that said, "I knew this was wrong, even when I went along with it." The last exit from something you didn't have the courage to stop. She didn't excuse what he'd done, but she understood the arithmetic of fear, and she knew it didn't take a villain to let bad things continue. It just took enough people who were more afraid than they were angry. Until something changed the calculation. She untied Bess from the rail and mounted and turned the horse toward the north road. She wanted to get back to the ranch before dark. She wanted to see Hazel's face when she heard what Finch had done, and Clara's careful, quiet nod, and May's immediate and wholehearted demand for every detail in the correct order. She was halfway up the main street when she heard someone call her name. She pulled up and turned. It was Caleb, Mrs. Pratt's neighbor's boy, 17, who'd been staying near the ranch. He was running up the street toward her with his hat in his hand and the particular breathless urgency of someone who's been running since before he started thinking about whether he should. "Miss Rowan," he got out and stopped to breathe. "What's wrong?" "3 men," he panted, "rode out to the ranch about an hour ago, right after you left this morning." He straightened, still breathing hard. "I was at the fence line when they came up the road. I came to town soon as I could." Her hands tightened on the reins. "What did they want?" "The older girl, Hazel, she talked to them at the gate, wouldn't let them inside. They had a paper, said it was a notice of property inspection. She told them she needed to see documentation from the county office, and they didn't have it." He paused. "They didn't leave, though. They parked themselves on the road outside the gate. Last I saw, they were still there." Eliza looked at him for a moment. Then she turned Bess north and kicked her into a canter. She came up the ranch road at speed and slowed when she saw the 3 horses on the road outside the gate, just as Caleb had described. The men beside them looked up when she came around the bend. She didn't stop to talk to them. She rode through her own gate and up to the barn. Hazel was in the yard. She was standing near the well, not near the barn, standing in the open where she could see the road clearly, with her arms crossed and her back straight and that controlled, watching expression on her face. May was in the barn doorway behind her, visible but not out in the open. Claire was not visible, which meant she was in the root cellar or just inside the barn wall, and she'd stationed herself that way deliberately. These three girls had positioned themselves like people who were not going to run. Eliza came off the horse and crossed the yard to Hazel. "You all right?" she said. "Yes." Hazel's eyes flicked to the road and back. "They said it was a property inspection. They don't have the authority anymore." Eliza turned and looked at the three men on the road. "The judicial notice suspends all county actions. Any inspection would need to come from the territorial office." "I told them something like that. Not exactly those words." "What words did you use?" Hazel was quiet for half a second. "I said I'd like to see their documentation from the county office, and that without it they weren't authorized to enter the property, and that I'd be sending word to Mrs. Pratt if they needed to be reminded of what the law said about unannounced inspections." Eliza looked at her. "Where'd you learn about unannounced inspections?" "I didn't. I made it sound like I did." The faintest thing moved across Hazel's face. Not quite satisfaction, but close to it. "They didn't know either." Eliza turned back to the road. The three men were watching her. One of them, the one in the center who'd been doing the talking when Caleb had described it, was the same type as the man who'd delivered the accelerated tax notice. Not county officials, just hired weight. Granger's people, sent before he knew what was happening in the council hall. She walked to the gate. "The county judicial notice suspending all land actions against this property is now on file with the Larimer County Council and with the Territorial Land Office in Harmon City," she said. "If you've been hired by Silas Granger to conduct an inspection of this property, I'd suggest you go back and have a conversation with him about whether that's still a good idea. Today may have changed some things." The man in the center looked at her with the expression of someone who's been given instructions that don't quite fit the situation he's found himself in. He was not stupid. She could see him running the arithmetic. "We'll be in touch," he said finally. "Through proper channels," she said. "In writing. To the county council. Not to me directly." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then reined his horse around. The three of them rode back down the road without further comment. She stood at the gate and watched them go until they were past the bend in the road and out of sight. Then she turned back to the yard. Hazel was still standing near the well. May had come out from the barn doorway and was now standing in the yard proper. Clara appeared from just inside the barn. She'd been right there the whole time, pressed to the barn wall inside the door with a clear sightline to the gate. The four of them stood in the cold yard for a moment. "They're gone?" May said. "For now." "Are they coming back?" "Maybe, but it'll be harder for them to." Eliza looked at all three of them. This improbable arrangement she'd made 6 weeks ago in a council meeting she'd walked into for lack of anywhere better to be. "I want to tell you what happened in town this morning. But first, are you hungry?" May's face said yes immediately, and the rest of her body was slightly slower catching up. "Come inside," Eliza said. Bam. She told them over supper. Beans again, because they still had them, and the last of the cornbread. She told them about the council meeting, about Granger standing at the end of the room, about reading the judicial notice onto the table in front of Keach. She told them about Dellum standing up, and Jesse Pryor after him and Werner with his papers. She told them about Finch. Hazel went very still when she got to that part. Not the watchful stillness of waiting for bad news, something different. She put her spoon down slowly and looked at the table. "He kept the original files," she said. "Yes." "The whole time?" "Yes." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "Pa went to his office once. I don't know what about. He came home, not angry exactly, tired." She looked at her hands on the table. "I think he tried to tell Finch something. I think Finch already knew and didn't help him." Eliza didn't say anything. "And today he helped," Hazel said. "Today he did." Hazel picked her spoon back up. She looked at her bowl rather than at Eliza. "I don't know how I feel about that," she said flatly. "You don't have to know tonight," Eliza said. Hazel ate a spoonful of beans. "No," she said, "I don't." Clara, across the table, had been listening with her usual complete attention. She said quietly, "Will Granger be arrested?" "That's for the investigation to determine," Eliza said. "It's going to take time. The territorial attorney's office will be involved. There will be hearings." She looked at all of them. "This isn't going to be fast. I want you to understand that. We've stopped the immediate threat to the ranch. We've got the judicial notice in place, but the larger thing, the investigation, the fraud case, what happens to Granger, that runs on legal time, which is slower than real time. But we stay? May said. She asked it with the particular directness of someone who wants the most important information first. We stay, Eliza said. May nodded and went back to her cornbread with the decisive air of someone who has received the only information that really mattered and can now process the rest. Hazel looked at Eliza from across the table. The lamplight made her look older than 13, and also, for just a moment, exactly her age. A child who had held herself together through something she shouldn't have had to hold herself together through, and who was now, very quietly, letting some of that weight down. You said this morning that it was going to get worse before it got better, she said. I said that last night, Eliza said, to myself. I didn't say it to you. I know, I heard you. Hazel met her eyes. Was it? Worse? Eliza thought about the 3 men on the road outside the gate, about Granger's recalibrating eyes as he walked out the blue door, about the things that weren't resolved and wouldn't be for months. Some parts, she said, but it also moved. Things that were stuck have started to move. Hazel considered that. That's something, she said. It is, Eliza agreed. It's not everything, but it's something. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, which was unusual for this time of year. The valley sat in an uncommon stillness, and somewhere out in the east field, below the frozen ground, the well held its water, patient and cold and no longer hidden, no longer only a dead man's secret but a documented fact, surveyed and notarized and now in the hands of people who had the authority to do something with it. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was the first night in 6 weeks that Eliza went to sleep on her hay pallet in the barn without the arithmetic running in her head, without the numbers, the deadlines, the calculations of what she had against what she needed. The numbers were still there. The problems were still there. But the shape of the thing had changed, and she was tired enough, and the barn was warm enough, and the sound of 3 small, steady breathing presences in the dark around her was particular enough that she closed her eyes and let it be what it was. Tomorrow, there would be more to do. There was always more to do. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like they were doing it from ground that was actually theirs. Winter settled into the valley the way it always did, without asking and without apology. The weeks after the council meeting were not triumphant. They were cold and slow and full of the particular grinding uncertainty of waiting for institutions to move at their own pace while your life moved at its own faster, hungrier one. The judicial notice held. Granger made no further moves against the property directly, which was not the same as retreating. It was the tactical patience of a man who understood that a suspended process was not a closed one, and who had lawyers in Harmon City who were presumably doing what lawyers do when powerful men feel the ground shifting under them. Eliza knew this because Mrs. Pratt told her, and Mrs. Pratt knew it because she had spent 60 years in this valley, accumulating the kind of knowledge that only comes from paying attention to things other people consider beneath their notice. He'll try to discredit Cutter's survey, Mrs. Pratt said on one of her visits to the ranch. She had taken to stopping by twice a week, on no particular schedule, always with something in a basket, always staying for coffee, and staying longer than the coffee required. He'll argue the geological findings are speculative. He'll say the deed language was standard reclassification authorized by county code and that anyone who signed it understood what they were signing. Will that work? Eliza asked. Not with Finch's files on the table, it won't. Mrs. Pratt wrapped her hands around her cup. Finch documented the specific instructions he was given for each amendment. He noted which landowners were told they were signing a water use reclassification and which ones were told nothing at all and simply had the amended deed returned to them as the file copy. She paused. Thomas was in the second category. Eliza thought about that. Thomas Calloway had found the discrepancy himself, had dug it out of the records with the thoroughness of a man who read the fine print because he'd learned the hard way that fine print mattered. He hadn't been told what he'd signed. He'd figured it out, and then he'd done something about it. And the doing something about it had cost him everything. She thought about that more than she let on to the girls. She thought about the randomness of it, the particular chain of circumstances that had to be true simultaneously for Thomas Calloway's work to survive him. The journals hidden in the chimney gap, Claire's habit of noticing things, Cutter's preserved conscience, Finch's compulsive record-keeping, which might have been cowardice dressed as caution, but had turned out to be the thread that unraveled the whole fabric, and Eliza herself, arriving in Iron Creek with $43 and no plan, walking into a council meeting because she had nowhere else to be. None of it had been designed. None of it was inevitable. It had just been people, doing and not doing, and the accidental overlap of their choices producing something that none of them could have produced alone. She didn't find that comforting, exactly, but she found it true, which was the more useful thing. Attempt. The territorial attorney's investigation formally opened in the last week of November. 2 investigators arrived in Iron Creek on a Tuesday, stayed at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, and spent 3 days going through the county land records with the systematic thoroughness of people who do this for a living and have learned not to be surprised by what they find. Eliza met with them once, at Keach's office, with Finch present and Mrs. Pratt. As what she'd described as a character witness, though in practice, Mrs. Pratt mostly sat in the corner and watched the investigators the way she watched most things, carefully, without apparent judgment, in a way that made people slightly more careful about what they said. The lead investigator was a woman named Cordelia Nash, younger than Eliza had expected, maybe 30, with the precise, unhurried quality of someone who understood that precision was faster than speed. She asked good questions. She did not ask them twice. She looked at the deed comparison files with exactly the attention they deserved and wrote things in her notebook without comment. At the end of the meeting, Nash said, "This is going to be a lengthy process. I want to be clear about that. The fraud charge requires establishing intent, which means building a case from the documentary evidence and the testimony of affected parties. That takes time." "How much time?" Eliza asked. "The formal case filing will likely take 4 to 6 months. Any court proceedings beyond that are harder to estimate." 4 to 6 months. She kept her face neutral. "What happens to the Callaway property in the meantime?" she asked. "The judicial notice remains in effect until the investigation concludes. The property can't be seized, assessed beyond its current rate, or transferred." Nash looked at her. "You're secure on the land. What you're not secure on is the broader outcome. That depends on what the case builds to." It was an honest answer. Eliza appreciated honest answers even when she didn't like them. She rode home through the early December cold and thought about 4 to 6 months, and what 4 to 6 months looked like when you were living in a barn with 3 children and the last of your money was nearly gone. She thought about what the barn would look like in April. She thought about the well, which was producing clean, cold water consistently now, and about the 80 acres of land under the winter sky, and about the burned chimney standing in the yard like a marker. She thought, you need to start building. The house started in the 3rd week of December, and it was an ugly, slow, imperfect process that she was proud of in exact proportion to how hard it was. Keach had found her a carpenter named Odell, who owed him a favor of some unspecified and apparently significant nature, and who arrived on a Monday with 2 young men and enough lumber to begin the frame. He was a taciturn, precise man who communicated mostly through the angle of his eyebrows, and who, after the first day, accepted Hazel's presence at the worksite without comment and began explaining what he was doing in the slightly louder, slightly slower way that people use when they've realized someone is actually paying attention and might as well learn it right. Eliza worked alongside them when the girls were occupied with other things, and worked until her hands were so cold she had to stop, and then warmed them by the barn stove and went back out. She was not skilled at this. She made mistakes that Odell corrected without making her feel worse about them than necessary, which was its own form of kindness. Clara, unexpectedly, turned out to have a talent for measuring. She had a patience for the repetitive precision of measurement that nobody else on the worksite quite matched, and she would go over a measurement twice without being asked, and she was never wrong, and Odell started leaving the measuring tape in a spot where she could reach it without having to ask. He never said anything to her directly about this. He just left the tape there, and Clara just picked it up when it was needed. It was one of the small, wordless negotiations that made the worksite function better than it had any right to, given what it was made of. May mostly stayed out of the way, which she achieved by finding a vantage point on the fence rail from which she could watch everything and ask questions at a volume and frequency that was eventually regulated by a system Hazel implemented. May got 5 questions per hour, and she had to save them up. That seems harsh, Eliza said, when Hazel explained the system. She asked Odell 14 questions in the first 20 minutes, Hazel said. He's a man who communicates mostly through silence. Fair point, Eliza said. The frame went up in December and the walls followed in January, slow and cold, and interrupted by weather that didn't care about anyone's schedule. The roof took the better part of 2 weeks because a February ice storm stopped work for 4 days, and then a section of roofing had to be redone because the first attempt had a drainage problem that would have meant trouble come spring. Odell discovered this himself, on his own initiative, and fixed it without being asked, which Eliza noted and intended to repay somehow when she was in a position to. By the end of February, the house was not finished, but it was livable. 4 walls, a sound roof, a new hearth that drew properly, 2 rooms with floors, and a third that was getting there. They moved out of the barn on a Saturday in late February, carrying their things across the yard in the cold morning air, and the first night in the house was simultaneously better and stranger than she'd expected. The barn had been theirs in a particular way, small and close and accidental, thrown together by necessity. The house was theirs in a different way, a way that felt larger and less certain and more real. She lay awake the first night in the new room and listened to the sounds the house made, the wood settling, the wind at the new windows, and felt, in the specific way that comes from finishing something hard, that she was still not sure she'd done the right thing, which was not the same as feeling she'd done the wrong one. The investigation moved with its own geological patience. Spring came, and with it 2 more visits from the territorial attorney's office and a formal hearing date set for June, and a summons for Silas Granger to appear before the territorial court to answer fraud charges on 11 counts. The night the summons was served, Mrs. Pratt came to the house for supper. She had taken to doing this once a week or so, and Eliza had stopped trying to identify when exactly the visits had shifted from acts of practical support to something closer to habit. It was just how things were now. Mrs. Pratt came on Thursday evenings, and they ate supper, and they talked, and May told her about whatever she was currently most interested in, which changed weekly and was always described with the same comprehensive intensity regardless of subject matter. He's retained 2 lawyers from the Capitol, Mrs. Pratt said, over the supper table, and he's been talking to the territorial newspaper. His position is that the amendments were authorized by county code and that any party who signed without reading the full language is responsible for their own lack of due diligence. He's going to argue it was legal, Eliza said. He's going to argue it was legal, yes. The question is whether the judge agrees, Hazel said from across the table. It wasn't legal. She said it plainly, the way she stated most things, not with heat, just with certainty. No, Mrs. Pratt agreed, but the law isn't always about what's true. It's about what can be demonstrated. She looked at Hazel steadily. Which is why the documentation matters. Which is why your father spent June making sure there was documentation. Hazel looked at her bowl for a moment. She was 14 now. She'd had a birthday in March, which they'd celebrated with a cake that Clara had made from a recipe Mrs. Pratt provided, and which had turned out somewhat lopsided but entirely correct in flavor. Do you think he knew? Hazel asked. When he did all that, went to get things notarized, hid the journals, do you think he knew he wasn't going to get to use it himself? The table was quiet. Mrs. Pratt set down her fork. I think he knew it was dangerous, she said carefully. I think he did it anyway because he believed it needed to be done. Whether he knew how dangerous, she paused. I don't know. I think he hoped he was wrong about how far Granger would go. Hazel nodded slowly. She picked up her fork. I think about that a lot, she said. Whether he was scared? He was, Mrs. Pratt said with certainty. He absolutely was. He was scared and he did it anyway, which is the only kind of courage that counts. May, who had been eating her supper with unusual quietness and therefore with unusual attentiveness to the conversation, said, Miss Eliza was scared too. When she went to the Capitol, I could tell. Eliza looked at her across the table. You came back, though, May said. She said it as a statement of fact rather than a compliment, in the way of 6-year-olds who have not yet learned to dress observations up. I came back, Eliza agreed. May went back to her supper, apparently satisfied that this was the important part. The hearing was in June, in Harmon City, and Eliza attended it with Finch and Ray Dellum and Jesse Pryor and Callum Werner and Mrs. Pratt and 7 other property holders from Larimer County who'd signed amended deeds and were prepared to testify. They rode down on a Wednesday, and the hearing lasted 3 days, which was 2 days longer than Eliza had expected and 1 day shorter than Nash had warned her to prepare for. She testified on the second morning. She had been rehearsing what she would say for weeks, trying to find the version that was clear and factual and not emotional in a way that would be easy to dismiss. She sat in the chair in that wood-paneled room and looked at the judge. Not Moss, a different one, a man named Hendry who had a reputation for impatience with wasted time, and told him what she'd found, in the order she'd found it, in the same flat, sequential way she'd told it to Margaret Hale and Arthur Senn and Moss himself back in November. The cross-examination was conducted by one of Granger's capital lawyers, who was skilled and precise and worked at the edges of her testimony, looking for inconsistencies the way water finds cracks in stone. He found 2 places where her memory of precise dates was uncertain, and he made something of those. He found nothing else to work with because the documents were the documents, and the documents did not have uncertain dates. When it was over, she went and sat in the anteroom on a bench and let herself shake for about 4 minutes. She had not let herself shake in the hearing room. 4 minutes felt approximately correct, and then she stood up and went back in. Finch was the last to testify, on the 3rd morning. He took the chair with the particular combination of resignation and resolve that she'd come to understand was his characteristic mode when doing something that cost him, something he'd decided to do and wasn't going to enjoy and was going to do anyway. He laid out the 11 amendments, one by one, with the supporting documentation he'd kept, and he explained with careful precision the specific instructions he'd received for each one and who had given them. He was on the stand for 2 hours. Granger's lawyers worked at him hard. He didn't break and he didn't embellish, and he answered every question with the same painstaking accuracy he'd brought to his record-keeping, which was, in the end, both his indictment and his testimony. The same quality of mind that had let the fraud happen also created the paper trail that made it undeniable. At one point towards the end, Granger's lawyer asked him, "You've described yourself as following instructions. Why? If you believe those instructions were improper, did you follow them for 11 instances rather than reporting them immediately?" Finch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. And because I told myself that I wasn't entirely sure they were improper, which was not true, but was easier to believe than the alternative." He looked at the judge, not the lawyer. "I've had a long time to think about that. I don't have a better answer." The judge noted it without comment and moved on. The verdict came 6 weeks after the hearing. Silas Granger was found liable on 9 of the 11 fraud counts. The 2 remaining counts were determined to lack sufficient evidence of direct personal authorization, which meant his land commissioner in those specific cases had acted beyond his explicit instruction, a distinction that the lawyers had fought over and that ultimately cost Granger 2 counts, but not the case. The 9 counts were enough. His land holdings were subject to asset review. His county commissioner's office was dissolved and reorganized under territorial oversight. The water rights that had been fraudulently transferred were ordered restored to the original property holders, with compensation to be determined in a separate civil proceeding that would, Nash had warned Eliza, take considerably longer. Granger himself was not imprisoned. His lawyers negotiated a financial settlement in lieu of criminal sentencing that was, Mrs. Pratt said when she heard it, a lesser outcome than Thomas Calloway deserved, and a greater one than Granger had expected. This was probably the most honest accounting of an imperfect legal outcome that Eliza had heard, and she held on to it as such. Justice, she'd come to understand, was not a clean thing. It came in pieces and degrees and with exceptions and incomplete resolutions, and you took what you could get and you didn't pretend it was more than it was. She thought about Finch's 2 undocumented counts. She thought about the notary who'd died in August. She thought about what had burned in the house fire and what had survived by accident behind a chimney. She thought, the world is not fair, and fighting anyway is still the only right thing to do. The summer that followed the verdict was the first one that felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of an emergency. The water cooperative was Hazel's idea, which she presented at supper one evening in early July with the directness she brought to most ideas. Not as a proposal exactly, more as a statement of what seemed obvious once she'd thought about it. There are 6 families in the Northern Valley who are going to lose cattle this dry season because their water access is still being worked out in the civil proceedings, Hazel said. We have the well. We have more water than we need for ourselves. There's no reason not to share it while the legal situation gets sorted. Eliza looked at her across the table. Formally? In writing. So nobody's taking advantage and nobody feels like they're accepting charity. Hazel said the last word with a particular emphasis that made clear she understood the distinction mattered in a place like this. An agreement. They contribute something, labor, supplies, whatever they have, and we provide water access. When the water rights are restored to their properties, the agreement ends or changes depending on what people want. Clara, who had been thinking about this for possibly longer than the conversation had been happening, said, "You'd need a written contract." "Yes. Finch would probably help draft it," Clara said. "He's been trying to make himself useful." She said it without bitterness, as a practical observation. Eliza looked between them. Hazel, 14, with her father's methodical mind and her mother's capacity for seeing what needed doing and just doing it. Clara, almost 11, who noticed things and measured carefully and had spent a year learning quietly and precisely from everyone around her, absorbing knowledge the way the Eastfield absorbed water. Slow, deep, thorough. "That's a good idea," Eliza said. Hazel nodded, already moving on in her head to the practical details. "I'll need to ride to the 6 families, explain it properly. I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Eliza said. "I want to." Hazel looked at her briefly, with the look she reserved for things that surprised her. Not showing it much, but showing it enough. Then she went back to her supper and said, "We should go Saturday, before the heat gets worse." They went Saturday. The cooperative formed over the course of August. It was not elegant. The agreements were hand-drafted and took 3 revisions because Ray Dellum had concerns about liability that were reasonable and had to be addressed. And 2 of the 6 families initially declined because they weren't sure they wanted to be in formal arrangement with anyone after the years of Granger's compulsory assessments, which was a completely understandable position that Eliza respected and left open for them to revisit if they changed their minds. 4 families signed. 2 more came in by September when the dry season proved worse than expected, and the alternative was watching cattle lose condition. It was not a perfect system. There were arguments about access schedules and one incident involving Caleb, who was now working on the ranch full-time and had turned out to be considerably more capable than his initial fence-fixing suggested, and a neighbor's son over a water gate left open overnight. There were weeks when the administrative work of the cooperative added more to the day than Eliza could comfortably manage, and she stayed up too late doing paperwork and was short-tempered in the morning. May pointed this out once with the particular fearlessness of 7-year-olds. "You're being grumpy," she said at breakfast. "I'm tired," Eliza said. "You were up late doing the water papers again." "Yes." "You could ask Hazel to help with the water papers." "Hazel has other things to do." "She'd rather do the water papers than watch you be grumpy," May said, with complete confidence. Eliza looked at her. Then she looked at Hazel, who was eating her breakfast with the focused attention of someone very carefully not contributing to this conversation. "Hazel," Eliza said. "I'll take the water papers," Hazel said without looking up. "I was going to ask—" "I know what you were going to ask. I'll take the papers." She turned a page in the ledger she'd been keeping for the cooperative, which was already more organized than the version Eliza had started. "I've been wanting to restructure the access schedule anyway." May looked at Eliza with an expression of supreme satisfaction. "Thank you, May," Eliza said dryly. "You're welcome," May said, and went back to her breakfast. In October, a year after Eliza had stepped off the stagecoach in Iron Creek, Odell finished the 3rd room of the house and declared the building complete, which was his version of a ceremony. He stood in the yard and looked at what he'd built, what they'd all built, in pieces and stages, and around weather and money shortages and a February ice storm. And he nodded once, with the nod of a man who has made something that will outlast him and is satisfied with that. "It'll hold," he said. "Thank you," Eliza said. He waved this off and began loading his tools. He paused once, beside the fence, and looked at Clara, who was measuring the new window frame for curtain material with the measuring tape she'd long since stopped asking permission to use. He watched her work for a moment. She measures better than most men I've worked with, he said to Eliza quietly. I know, Eliza said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something, and went back to loading his tools. The house was not a grand thing. It was 4 rooms, sound walls, a proper roof, 2 windows on the south side that let in the afternoon light in a way that Eliza had not anticipated, and that made the main room feel, on clear days, like a different and better world. The hearth drew properly. The floors were level. The 3rd room, which had taken longest, was May's, and May had declared it the best room because it was hers, which was a logic difficult to argue with. They had a supper that night, all of them, plus Mrs. Pratt, plus Caleb, plus Ray Dellum and his wife, who had become something closer to friends than neighbors over the course of the cooperative's first months. Odell stayed for supper, which surprised everyone, including possibly himself, Mrs. Pratt brought wine, which she poured into the various cups and glasses available without ceremony, and gave May a small glass of watered-down cider and told her it was the same thing, which May did not entirely believe but accepted on good faith. There was no particular speech. Nobody toasted. Eliza had thought she might want to say something formal, but found, when the moment arrived, that there was nothing formal required. The people in that room knew what they were there for and what it had taken to get there, and saying it out loud would have been less true than just eating supper together in the house that hadn't existed a year ago. Dellum at one point said to her quietly, "You know what this valley looked like before? Before Granger started buying up the water rights?" He gestured with his fork at the window, at the dark outside. It wasn't much different from what it looks like now from the outside, but people didn't talk to each other the way they used to. You'd see a neighbor at the market and there'd be this calculation about how much to say, about who was paying what assessments, who was in his pocket, who wasn't. He paused. That's gone now. That careful quiet. People talk again. Eliza thought about that, about the specific quality of silence that fear creates. Not peaceful, not comfortable, but strategic. Everyone measuring their words by what they could cost. Your father would have fixed it himself, she said. He was already doing it. Maybe. Dellum looked at his plate. But he needed someone to finish it for him. She didn't say that she hadn't known that was what she was doing when she started, that she'd walked into a council meeting with no plan and raised her hand for reasons she still didn't entirely understand. She didn't say that the version of herself who'd stepped off that stagecoach with $43 and a broken arrangement and nowhere to go would not have recognized the woman sitting in this finished house at this table. She thought about that woman sometimes, tired, uncertain, holding a twine-tied suitcase with a buckled corner. And she thought that woman had been right to keep moving, even without a plan, because the absence of a plan is not the same as the absence of judgment. And judgment is what you actually need when a plan falls apart. Which it always does. That was the part they didn't tell you. Every plan falls apart at some point, and you navigate by something else, by what you can't live with not doing, by who's counting on you, by the narrow, specific voice that says, this is wrong, and I'm the one here, and you have to decide whether you're the kind of person who answers it. She had answered it. She was still figuring out what that meant. The civil proceedings on the compensation claims concluded the following spring, and the outcome was imperfect in the way that legal outcomes invariably are. Some families received full restoration of water rights, some received partial, and the compensation for lost revenues during the fraud period was calculated in ways that several parties considered inadequate and that took 2 additional hearings to partially address. The cooperative continued operating through all of it because the land needed water, regardless of what the courts were doing about who owned the rights to provide it. Finch resigned from the land commissioner's office the week after the verdict and took a position as a records clerk for the Territorial Archive in Harmon City, which was a demotion in every formal sense and appeared to suit him considerably better. He came back to Iron Creek once, the following summer, and stopped at the ranch on his way through and stood in the yard and looked at the house that had been a burned ruin when he'd first seen the property in the land records. I never came out here when Thomas was alive, he said. I should have. Eliza was by the fence, and she looked at him for a moment. He was thinner than he'd been during the council meetings. There was less of the tight, controlled blankness that had characterized his face in the days when he was carrying something he hadn't yet put down. No, she said. You should have. He nodded. He wasn't expecting absolution and she wasn't offering it, and they both understood this, and it was the most honest thing she could give him. "The archive work is quiet," he said, after a moment. "I like it." "That seems right," she said. He left without going inside, which was also right. Some things you don't get to walk into. You can only stand at the fence and acknowledge what's there. Hazel turned 15 that spring and informed Eliza, in the same direct way she informed people of most things, that she intended to study law when she was old enough to do so, and that she'd been corresponding with a woman in the capital who ran a women's auxiliary education program and who had told her there was a reading curriculum she could work through by post in the meantime. Eliza said, "I figured it would be something like that." Hazel looked at her. "Why?" "Because you've been interested in how things work legally since November, when you asked me to explain the difference between a judicial notice and an injunction." Hazel considered this. "That's a reasonable deduction. Do you need anything to get started?" "Books and postage for the correspondence, and—" She paused briefly. "And maybe an hour in the evening when May isn't asking questions." "That last one I can't guarantee." "I know." The almost smile that was Hazel's closest thing to full warmth. It was worth asking. Clara, at 11, had decided she wanted to learn surveying. This had developed gradually and then suddenly, the way her interest tended to, quietly accumulating until they reached a point where they declared themselves. She'd written to Ben Cutter in Miller's Crossing, in a letter that was more articulate than most adult correspondence Eliza had encountered, asking if he took apprentices and, if not, whether he might recommend a text she could study from. Cutter had written back with 2 textbooks and an invitation to come to Miller's Crossing for a week in the summer to look at field work in practice. He addressed the letter to Clara directly, not to Eliza, which Clara noticed and did not comment on but clearly registered. May, at 7, had opinions about everything and expertise about nothing and was perfect. Tucky, there was an evening that October, 2 years after the stagecoach, 2 years after the twine-tied suitcase and the arithmetic on the bed at Mrs. Caldwell's, when Eliza sat on the porch of the house that now existed where there had been a ruin and watched the light go down over the ridge, and thought about the particular distance between where she'd started and where she was. She was 33 years old. She had no husband, no money to speak of, a legal guardianship that would continue for years, a water cooperative that required more administrative work than she'd anticipated, and a house with 3 rooms that were always occupied by people who needed things. She was also, most evenings, tired in a way she hadn't been before. The deep, specific tiredness of someone who is spending themselves on something real and necessary and genuinely hers. She had not expected the tiredness to feel like belonging, but it did. Mrs. Pratt came around the corner of the house, because she visited on Thursday evenings, and it was Thursday, and she'd learned where the porch was without being told. She sat in the other chair without asking and looked at the ridge. "How are the books?" she said, meaning the cooperative's books, which she'd taken to reviewing quarterly with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd managed her own finances alone for 20 years and had opinions about ledger organization. "Better since Hazel took them over," Eliza said. A pause. "She's going to be something." "She already is something," Eliza said. Mrs. Pratt looked at her sideways. "You're allowed to be proud of them, you know. You don't have to be careful about it." Eliza looked at the ridge. The sky was going orange above it. "I know." "But?" "No but. I just—" She paused, trying to find the right description for something she hadn't put into words before. "I'm aware that I didn't make them. They were already who they are. I just kept them together, kept them in a place where they could keep being who they are." Mrs. Pratt was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing," she said. "Keeping people together in a place where they can keep being themselves." She looked at the ridge. "Most of the important things aren't small." The light continued going down. Inside the house, Eliza could hear May telling a story to Clara in the tone she used for stories. Dramatic, slightly too loud, building toward a conclusion that would probably not land the way she intended it to. Clara's occasional responses were inaudible, but implied. From the corner room, the faint sound of Hazel turning a page. The well in the east field held its water in the dark. as it always had, patient and unimpressed by anyone's plans for it. Eliza sat in the October cold on the porch of the house she hadn't built, and hadn't planned, and hadn't known she was looking for, and felt the particular and improbable weight of having built something real out of nothing at all, not through any special talent or foreknowledge, but through the simpler and harder thing of not walking away when walking away would have been easier. That was all it had ever been, the choice, made again and again, not to walk away. She thought about Thomas Calloway writing in his notebook, careful and afraid, making the same choice. She thought about him not knowing she would come, not knowing anyone would come, and making it anyway. She thought, maybe that's what courage actually is in the end. Not the certainty that it will matter, just the decision to act as if it will. From inside the house, May's story reached its conclusion. There was a beat of silence, and then Clara laughed. A short, real sound, not performative, not anticipated, just genuine. The kind of sound that comes when something actually lands. Eliza closed her eyes and listened to it. The ridge went dark above the valley. The stars came out one at a time, the way they do. Without announcement, without ceremony, just appearing when the sky was finally ready to show them. The story of Iron Creek did not end that evening. Stories of that kind don't end. They change shape, continue in the people who carry them forward, branch into things the original players never predicted. Hazel would study law and argue cases in rooms that didn't yet exist. Clara would measure things with the precision of someone who knows the difference between what you believe and what you can prove. May would tell stories about all of it, loudly, to anyone who would listen, and some of those stories would be accurate. But that evening, on that porch, in the October cold, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, exactly what it needed to be.